Good afternoon, everyone. This is Margie Tatro from GridWorks, joined with my colleagues Jay Griffin and Deborah Shields. And our colleagues and teammates from Southwestern Public Service are also here today to participate in this sixth meeting of the stakeholder engagement regarding the integrated resource plan that Southwest Public Service Company will be filing with the PRC, the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission, in October. So today is the 29th of August. We're recording this meeting for the benefit of those of you who may wish to re-listen to portions of today's meeting, and for others who could not be here today for their benefit. So here's our agenda for today. We're planning on really focusing our conversation on the modeling results to date that the SPS and Xcel Energy team have been working very hard over the past month, crunching numbers and gaining insight. So we will spend time discussing both the stakeholder requested run results and the SPS scenarios and runs, and then we'll have discussion about that after a break. We'll talk some more about what recommended portfolio suggestions are coming out of the analysis and talk about those. Then after another short break, we'll allow an introduction of really what is the action plan focused on, what are the constraints and the guidelines from the Integrated Resource Plan rule regarding action plan. And we will summarize our next steps, ask you all for a survey of how this meeting worked for you, and adjourn at 5 o'clock. So as you can see from the next slide, we are really focused here today on getting ready to prepare our input, our total stakeholder input into the action plan. And in a moment, I'll show you a picture of the different places where all of you, our valued stakeholders, have been providing input into this process. And there was one more very important place, and that is input to the action plan. So all of the insights and knowledge that we are gaining from the modeling results will inform the action plan. So we'll hear more about that from the utility team today. And we'll also describe for you the process that we are going to use to collect all of your input into the action plan. I want to say at this point that we are so appreciative of all of you being here and offering your insight through this very intense process that we are engaged in, and coming to this final push of action plan suggestions is a really important part. So we thank you for participating. We also appreciate that you've been along for this ride over the past 4 or 5 months, and we've all gained information, become more knowledgeable as a group of stakeholders. So for that, we thank you immensely for your participation. The next slide just shows you a familiar picture of where we've come. We worked in May and June to get everybody up to speed on what are the constraints, opportunities, challenges facing the utility. In July and August, modeling runs, action plans, discussion about statement of need, which started in the May-June timeframe, was concluded with a document that we're calling the Statement of Need Elements that the stakeholders put together in late July. And now we are moving to the action plan. And after the action plan, input is created and the utility considers that for their plan. We will finalize this process in a meeting in October, in which we learn from all of you how did this process overall worked for you. Now, there are a couple of announcements of meeting schedule changes. Some of them we talked about last time, and I wanted to just review those with you now, and we'll summarize this at the end of the meeting as well. Many of you know we extended the meeting in September 13th to be not just 2 hours, but 4 hours, because that is the primary and only dedicated session to finalizing input to the action plan. So we decided we really needed a bit more time for that. We've moved the meeting that was originally scheduled for September 21st. That's been moved to October 3rd, and it's been shortened to 2 hours. October 3rd is just less than 2 weeks before the utility will be filing their integrated resource plan with the commission. And we are very pleased that SPS executives and team are willing to share with the stakeholders on October 3rd the current status of their document and kind of give the final look before that document is submitted to the commission. So that's why we've adjusted the schedule a little bit to be aligned with this new process and to get the insights from modeling, but also give you all a chance to discuss action plan items, give the utility a chance to factor all this information in and report back to all of us on October 3rd on what are the main elements looking like for that document. So that's our path going forward. The next slide also brings you all up to date in terms of where we started, right? There are main places where the stakeholder input is and has been critical. First of all, in the statement of need, we had a working group put together elements of the statement of need, and many of you filled out the priority needs survey to let us and the utility know what were the most important attributes of the electric system in the future. Of course, the statement of need is also informed very much by modeling, and many of you stakeholders were active in the conversation of defining some stakeholder requested modeling runs, which we will hear more about the results of those today. But the purpose of those runs really is to inform options regarding a recommended portfolio or portfolios for resources for the utility going forward. So the final piece of the final piece where stakeholder input, and all these orange bubbles here are where stakeholder input has been incorporated. The final orange balloon or bubble is where stakeholder comments, suggestions, and recommendations regarding the action plan will be collected, discussed, and considered by the utility. So that's the piece we're focused on now, but I wanted just to give everybody a sense of the extraordinary value that's been contributed to date through the statement of need and through the stakeholder requested modeling runs. And we look forward to your input on the action plan as well as the third element of input from this process. So let me pause here and ask if there are questions about where we are, where we're going, any clarification or questions about this overall process. So please either raise your hand or just come off mute and ask if you have a question about what we've covered so far. Okay, well, great. Sounds like everybody's ready to go and anxious to hear the main feature of today's meeting, which is the results of the modeling. I'll turn the meeting over to Jay Griffin, and the next slide will describe really where we're going with this session. After he describes our overall plan, we'll do a tech check and make sure we can see the SPS slides. But Jay, would you like to go ahead and take over and let people know how we're going to conduct this next segment?
Sure. Thanks, Margie. Good day, everyone. This is Jay Griffin from GridWorks. We have a ton of material to go through today. And I know the SPS team has been working extremely hard to process all of this. So a portion of the presentation was sent and put on the GridWorks website. The other portion with the stakeholder requested runs, I think Ben and team were getting this up and going at the moment. So first I want to check with Ben see if we're ready to go on that, or if that still needs further work before you can present.
Yes, so the good news, Jay, is everything is ready to go and present today. We have all of SPS's modeling runs complete, and then all of the stakeholder requests runs complete. Just because those modeling scenarios were finished at different times, we've got 2 separate presentations. I think we're going to cover every item on your agenda here, but maybe in a slightly different order.
Okay, that's what I wanted to check. Which order were you planning here?
So kind of our recommendation, what we were going to do is we were going to step through all of the SPS modeling runs, including the resource portfolios and the PVRR impacts. And then we then have a second presentation where we were going to present SPS's sensitivities on gas prices and transmission network upgrades, and then also the stakeholder requested runs. Okay,
so let's folks here in the meeting, I think you heard the order of the presentation. I think Ben, let's go forward with that. I think our challenge here will be managing getting all that material out, presented to people on time, as well as allowing enough opportunity for people's questions and discussion. So I think the way we're going to handle this, we will still take the questions in chat. As we go through those, we're going to have to manage the time so we can make sure we can get through all the presentation material. And any questions that we're not able to get through here, we're going to take stock of that. And I think we have another item here. Margie's coming up. We're planning an additional check-in Q&A session, I believe, with Ben in the following week. So we're going to try and block out enough time for us to reconvene and go through that material. Margie, is that what you wanted to come on and say?
Yeah, exactly. We realize that you may have questions after today's presentation or during today's presentation that we don't have time to respond to. So please put those in the chat. Also, we've asked that if you have additional questions after the meeting today, please email those to Jay Griffin, and I've got a slide on this later on. Email those to Jay before this Friday, September the 1st at 5 p.m. The GridWorks team will take a look at those, aggregate them, try to combine like questions, and we'll host an information Q&A session on Wednesday, September the 6th at 3 p.m. via Zoom. And Deb will be sending an announcement out to that about that after this meeting. But we will use that hour to respond to any questions that didn't cover today or that come in to Jay by Friday of this week. So I wanted to let you know that this is not your only opportunity, and please keep those questions coming as needed. And thank you. Deb has put Jay's email address into the chat. Again, 5 p.m. Mountain Time on Friday is our requested delivery for any additional questions that will be teed up for response by the SPS team on September 6th at 3 p.m. Thanks, Jay.
Okay, thank you. I'll just reiterate, we asked for everyone's flexibility here. Ben and his team have been working extremely hard, so I think we're going to have an interesting discussion here, ton of worthwhile material to go through, and we look forward to that discussion. So Ben, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm not sure who on your side is going to be managing the presentation.
I think, Linda, if you don't mind sharing, that'd be fantastic.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Okay, so just in the interest of time, I've given this presentation maybe 2 or 3 times this week internally, and I tend to not get very far before getting a lot of questions. So I'm going to try and go through these presentations pretty quickly and give a lot of time for stakeholder questions. So if we're ahead of schedule, that would be pretty good. So Linda, if you can go to the next slide, please. And then the next slide. Okay, so first of all, I kind of want to start with the executive summary, as you will, of our modeling that we've conducted today. Just kind of point out some facts that pretty much ring true across most of the scenarios that we've looked at. So first of all, if we look at this kind of on a SWOT basis, and we look at our strengths. In every single scenario that we're going to look at today, regardless of whether we have a different load forecast, whether we have different gas price assumptions, we see a continued and substantial need for new low-cost renewable generation through the end of the decade and beyond. So every portfolio you're going to see today has a lot of wind and a lot of solar generation. However, what you're also going to see is you cannot provide a reliable and economic system on wind and solar alone. You are going to need dispatchable capacity to fulfill that energy need when those resources obviously are not generating. And that dispatchable capacity has to conform with the New Mexico's Energy Transition Act. That requires essentially zero carbon emissions after December 31st, 2044. So then when we get down to kind of the weaknesses in our analyses, if you look at what technologies are commercially available today that are both dispatchable and carbon free, really what you're looking at is lithium-ion battery energy storage. Batteries have obviously come down quite significantly in costs in recent years, but they are still relatively limited in duration. So you're typically looking anywhere between 4 and 8 hours is what we really see as being commercially economically viable right now. And then as we talk through these portfolios, the other big takeaway that hope everyone can get from this is you really cannot provide an economic or reliable system with just wind, solar, and 4-hour batteries. There needs to be additional technology that is both carbon-free, dispatchable, and not limited in duration. Now, right now, we're trying to keep our options as open as wide as possible here. Maybe that ends up being long duration storage. Maybe that ends up being hydrogen or carbon capture, new nuclear. There's many technologies that may come into the fold over the 20-year planning horizon. Let's go to the next slide, please, Linda. So the first question is, what really drives the different portfolios? And there is no other single variable that changes a resource plan analysis more than the load forecast. That really underpins every assumption we're going to talk about today. So we've looked at 3 different load forecasts in the IRP modeling. If we look at this line graph on the bottom left of the screen, you see the light blue line there is our financial forecast. So that is our most conservative load assumption. Then with the green line, you'll see our planning forecast, which is kind of our intermediate case. And then in the dark blue line, you're going to see what we're determining is the electrification and emerging technologies forecast. Full disclosure, this forecast, the high forecast, was requested by a stakeholder. This is based on some studies that have been conducted by third parties that show the potential load growth, particularly in the Permian and Delaware basins down in southeast New Mexico. And then as you see on the bar chart on the right side there, you see our capacity need, again, following those same color schemes, the blue, green, and dark blue. And you'll see as that load increases, our capacity need through the end of the decade and through the early 30s is obviously much, much greater. The bullet points at the top just kind of summarize our position. So if we look at those 3 different load forecasts, we have anywhere between a 4,800 megawatt peak to a 6,500 megawatt peak by 2030. And then if you assume the continued 15% plan and reserve margin, which is SPP requirement, we're going to have a capacity need anywhere between 1,760 megawatts and 3,768 megawatts by 2030. So a very large variance in capacity need. That number increases if we plan for a hypothetical 18% summer PRM requirement. And all of these numbers include approximately 1,800 megawatts of thermal generation retiring between now and 2030. We go to the next slide, please. Now what we're looking at is the resources our modeling added between now, and the end of the decade. So this is not the entire 20-year planning period. This is just between now and 2030, so 7-year time frame. Every single scenario that we're going to look at today added either the 3,500 megawatts of available wind generation or close thereof. Now, the 3,500 megawatts is somewhat of an arbitrary cap that we included within our modeling. we essentially included an annual cap of 1,000 megawatts of wind generation every year between 28, 29, and 30, plus an additional 500 megawatts of surplus wind generation at existing facilities. So in total, we allowed 3,500 megawatts of wind. And I said, you'll see that being selected in almost every scenario we look at. And then for solar generation, you'll see anywhere between 1,021 megawatts that was selected in every single case we looked at, all the way up to 3,131 megawatts. Now, the 1,021 megawatts, the lower band that's selected in every scenario, that's an important number because that essentially represents the gas steam units that we intend to retire between 28 and 30. We did not include any transmission network upgrade costs for that solar generation, that 1,021 megawatts. We assumed that would replace those thermal retiring units. When you start seeing the upper end of that bound going up to 3,000 megawatts, that's based on the other technologies the model can select, and we're going to get into this, and also the load forecast. And then, as I talked about earlier, there is no scenario where you can just go and add wind and solar generation to a portfolio. You have to have dispatchable resources. And that's what we see in this kind of this third item here, is under the planning forecast, we add anywhere between kind of 1,600 megawatts of dispatchable generation up to 2,500 megawatts. This is all nameplate generation. And then under that electrification emerging technologies forecast, we add anywhere from 3,300 megawatts up to 4,300 megawatts of dispatchable generation. Now, this is the part I cannot stress enough. This is all based on generic modeling assumptions. So right now we see the model encompass favoring wind generation over, say, solar generation. But that's based on generic cost estimates for each of those technologies. When we come to issue an RFP next year to seek these resources, obviously we'll redo this analysis based on actual market pricing. So we may see some wind projects lower cost than solar, in some solar projects lower cost than other wind. And what I expect to see just based on experience is a more balanced portfolio and not necessarily so heavy on wind. So I guess kind of like a takeaway for everyone today is maybe not to think of it so much as wind and solar, for example, and maybe think of it more just as a broader bucket as renewable energy, subject to the actual pricing we see in the market. If we can just go to the next slide. Just because of time constraints, I'm not going to talk through every single scenario that we've modeled. I'll kind of pick maybe the main base case type assumptions. I hate to call it that. But right now, just to kind of orientate everybody on this table, what we see from top to bottom is, first of all, we have the financial forecast results with a 15% planning reserve margin, and then a 18% summer and 20% winter planning reserve margin. Then as we step down, we go to our intermediate forecast, our planning forecast under the same assumptions. And then finally, we have our electrification and emerging technologies assumptions. We have the four technology scenarios that we ran for each. We have the multi-jurisdictional baseline, which we have described in previous meetings. This is mainly for informational purposes for our other jurisdictions. This is the only scenario we'll be looking at during these meetings, or this meeting, that does not conform with the Energy Transition Act. So in other words, in this case, what we're doing is we're setting aside state-specific requirements, and we're just letting the model select the lowest cost portfolio of resources. Then as we step down through the different technologies we have, what we're shortlisting here is existing technologies, but really, to give it its full name, it's existing, commercially available, carbon-free technologies. So under the existing technology cases, the only resources the model can add is new wind, new solar, and 4, 6, and 8-hour lithium-ion batteries. The third scenario is long-duration storage. So in this case, we're allowing all of the existing technologies I just explained, plus 100-hour multi-day storage devices. And then we go down to the hydrogen conversion case. Within the hydrogen conversion case, essentially we're allowing new gas generation to be built. And then by 2033, it would be 30% by volume hydrogen And then by 2038, I believe, it would be 96% by volume hydrogen. Now, those numbers do coincide with the EPA's 111D, I believe. So again, we're trying to incorporate stakeholder feedback into those assumptions. That was requested that we incorporate 111D. So again, without wanting to step through all of these results, what I'm going to concentrate first on is the plan and forecast. So kind of in the middle of this spreadsheet under the existing 15% plan and reserve margin. I'll step through these results and then, everyone else can step through the other sensitivities on their own time. If we start on the multi-jurisdictional baseline and we see the resource portfolio that will be added, essentially we're going to add 700 megawatts of new combustion turbine generators, so that'd be approximately 3 F-class Siemens CTs, and 837 megawatts of new combined cycles, so a new 2-on-1 combined cycle, 100 megawatts of lithium-ion 4-hour batteries, and then as I mentioned on the previous slide, the full 3,500 megawatts of wind and 1,300 megawatts of solar generation. So if you total that up, the recommended portfolio under this case, and again, keep in mind, this does not conform to the EPA, I cannot stress that enough, you would be adding 6,400-ish megawatts of new generation. If we use that as kind of the lower end of the book, the lower book end here, now let's look at the higher book end and we look at the existing technology. So again, this is assuming just wind, solar, 4-hour, 6-hour, and 8-hour lithium-ion batteries. So now obviously there's no new gas generation, so you can see there's no new resources added there. And what we actually see is an additional 2,220 megawatts of battery energy storage. And what's kind of interesting here is we don't see much of a difference in the renewable energy build out between now and 2030. And then as we step up kind of to these two other cases, the long duration case and the hydrogen case, under the long duration case, we see slightly less storage resources being added and more solar generation being added. And then under the hydrogen case, you see us adding, again, some gas CTs combined cycle at the beginning, with the understanding those units are going to then be converted to hydrogen, as I mentioned, with those blending profiles in 33 and 38. So to look at the cost implications here of these scenarios, the multi-jurisdictional base case is being kind of set to 0, so that's kind of your starting point. And if we then look at the additional cost of these alternative portfolios, what you essentially see is the existing technologies is about $4.1 billion, that's with a B, so $4.1 billion more expensive on a present value basis between 24 and 2043. In other words, in order to meet that portfolio, without any other technologies coming online, any other emerging technologies, you simply just got to keep adding more and more and more and more batteries. This really highlights the need for kind of this newer technology, this is emerging technology that is both dispatchable, carbon-free, and then economic, and then also not limited duration. So we look at the long duration scenario, and you see that resource portfolio is an extra $1.6 billion. And then the hydrogen conversion is an extra $2.3 billion. Now, if we can just go quickly to the next slide, I'm sure we'll have some questions on this one. We then essentially have the same layout of the table, but now we're looking at our resource need through 2040, not just 2030. So if we concentrate on the same scenario, the plan and forecast with a 15% plan and reserve margin, the financial impacts on the left are all the same. They're just copied and pasted from the previous slide. But now we look at the resource portfolios that are being added. If you looked again at the multi-jurisdictional baseline, you're adding 5,000 megawatts of gas, mostly peaking CTs, and then you're adding around 9,000 megawatts of wind and solar, so variable energy resources. As you start limiting the dispatchable technology, if you just go down to existing lithium-ion batteries, then you see a very, very large build out of lithium-ion storage. So about 8,400 megawatts of new batteries with 11,000 megawatts of new renewable generation. And then if you start factoring in, you start layering in likely or probable potential developments, improvements in long duration storage. Obviously, what you now start seeing is with this longer duration storage is you need a lot less of it then you would need equivalent 4-hour, 6-hour batteries. So that's why you see this huge reduction in storage required under a long duration storage case. And then when you look at the hydrogen case, now you're incorporating in the potential cost of a hydrogen conversion. You still do see some gas generation at the front end of the model, but what you start seeing is less gas generation come online because it's looking at that future hydrogen conversion cost and a transition more to battery energy storage and some higher renewable generation. Let's just go to the next slide real quickly. Here's a more granular view of the cost of the portfolios. So when I say a portfolio is going to cost $1 billion more, or $2 billion more, $4 billion more, what we're actually looking at here is the total system cost on a present value basis. Now it's the total generation system. So we're looking at total fuel costs, capital costs, fixed O&M, all of those costs that would be required to serve that customer load. Now I do apologize, I didn't realize until we kind of finalized this presentation that I did swap the order on you guys a little bit here. So now we do start with the planning forecast and then the financial and then the electrification. So I apologize for the confusion. But what we're essentially looking at is if we look at the 15% planning load, multi-jurisdictional baseline, which is the first line item, what we're going to be saying here is between 24 and 29 on a present value basis, the cost of this portfolio is $6.6 billion. We were to compare that to the existing technology case during the same time frame, you'd be looking at about $7 billion. So if you compare the cost of those two scenarios, the existing technology case is about $381 million more expensive on a present value basis between 24 and 29. As you step to those columns to the right, you just look at increasingly longer time periods. So the middle column compares present value costs between 24 and 33, and then the right columns compare present value costs between 24 and 43. So again, this really demonstrates when you start looking at these deltas in present value costs, that reliance solely on wind, solar, and just 4-hour to 8-hour batteries is not an economically viable solution. You need breakthroughs in these emerging technologies, these long duration storage, these hydrogen conversions, linear generates, whatever else that technology may be, in order to achieve the Energy Transition Act at a relatively economic level. So we can go to the next slide, please, Linda. The one thing that I do want to kind of caveat with people is the accuracy of this modeling is not the same for each scenario. So we're basing all of our modeling on generic cost estimates. And the accuracy of those estimates is obviously dependent upon maturity. So if we look at the cost of wind and solar and lithium-ion batteries and CTs and CTCs, these are technologies that are commercially available today. And yes, we don't know exactly what the cost of those technologies are going to be until we start seeing an RFP, but we have a good indication of what those costs are going to be. When we start looking at long duration storage, which is 100-hour storage, so multi-day storage, we've got some pilot programs in place at Exel Energy, but we're really not seeing this technology necessarily bid into an RFP. So we've had to make some assumptions using publicly available data. But again, just keep in mind the margin of error is much, much greater here. And similar to hydrogen, to maybe a slightly lesser extent, I think we got some projections on what the cost of hydrogen is going to be, but then there's lots of other questions like, do you end up, is it hydrogen that is there a market for hydrogen? How much does the pipeline cost, the infrastructure cost to deliver that pipeline? So there's those sort of questions that we also have to see or have to consider. So if we go to the next slide. This is actually the last slide in this presentation. I purposely went through this very quick, so I know we're going to get a lot of questions. But let me just kind of summarize what we saw in those previous tables. Regardless of the scenario that you look at, even if you just set aside the Energy Transition Act and you build new gas generation, you're going to see a substantial build out of renewable energy generation by the end of this decade. So you're going to see 4,300 megawatts of new renewables to up to 6,600 megawatts of new renewable generation. The actual mix between wind and solar, like I said, is likely to change based on the RFP. Just adding new wind and solar generation alone is not going to be able to provide a reliable system. You have to have dispatchable generation. And again, we look at that range, we're looking anywhere between 1,000 megawatts, which to be honest is on the very, very low side, up to 4,300 megawatts of dispatchable capacity. So total resource additions by the end of this decade, somewhere in the region of 5,000 to 10,000 megawatts. And to provide some context there, just like what a huge, huge lift this actually is the SPS system currently has around 7,500 megawatts of installed capacity. That 7,500 megawatts of capacity has an accredited capacity of about 5,400 megawatts, and we have a current system peak of around 4,200 megawatts. Now, again, I got to stress when we look at these ranges, this 5,000 to 10,000 megawatts, this is on the assumption that these projects or this amount of resources, one, turns up to an RFP, and two, turns up at the prices that we modeled. So let's look at that 3,500 megawatts of wind, for example. We've obviously had to produce cost estimates to model the cost of that wind. If that wind turns up at 5 times the cost that we modeled, then we're probably not going to build 3,500 megawatts of wind. We're going to probably build more solar, more batteries, whatever that technology may be. So just keep that in mind. These are ranges that are subject to confirmation from a future RFP. Let me pause there. That was the end of this presentation. I know there was a lot of data there. I went through extremely quickly. So Jay, I know we kind of initially thought about just clarifying questions, but I think it would be good to ask some questions here, break, and then do the second presentation.
Sure. No, and I think we've had a flurry come in right towards the end. Thanks, Ben, for I think pushing through that material. I think it was clear. And we're going to go through, let's see, we have a number of questions in the chat. So we're going to please go in order. If you ask multiple questions, let's try and take them one at a time. So Jeff Pollock, you had a question about the thermal retirements.
Yeah, so Ben, on slide 4, you said that the forecast includes 1,825 megawatts of thermal retirements by 2030. Were those retirements determined based on the age alone of those plants, or are they based on an economic analysis, so looking at the going forward revenues and the going forward costs?
Yeah, so I think there's maybe a slight variance between them. We've got a coal plant which we've done substantial economic analysis on. So we have kind of that perspective. We have some gas steam units, Nichols 1, Nichols 2, for example, where we have done economic analyses to extend those units by 5 years previously. And then we have maybe 4 or 5 other gas steam units where we're really just basing that, Jeff, right now on their scheduled retirement date, which is based on age. When we get the results of the RFP next year, what we will do is we will evaluate the cost of resource acquisitions versus the potential to extend some of those units maybe a little bit further into the future and see what's kind of in the best interest. It's tricky to do that analysis until you actually see the cost of the replacement generation.
Jeff, was that cover your question? Oh, I see Brooke has her hand up. She have a clarification.
Ben, is part of that discussion of the retirements, I was just curious how we looked at, maybe describe how we looked at the expiring PPAs in this time frame as well.
Yeah, so we assumed the PPAs would expire at the end of their current contract date, unless we have any agreements in principle in place where they may be potentially already being extended. But for the most part, we assumed they would be expire when their contracts currently expire. Now, those PPAs can and probably will bid in to future RFPs.
So it's possible that those PPAs could get extended.
Yes, absolutely. absolutely, Jeff. So when we issue the RFP next year, I would be surprised if we didn't see existing PPAs bid into that RFP process.
And most of those are wind PPAs anyway, so those would certainly help you satisfy the requirements.
Correct. Yep. Most of our existing wind PPAs are correct. They are wind generators.
I think next we had somebody raise their hand, and Kara Lynch, do you have a question?
Sure.
I do. Thanks, Ben, for your presentation. I have a couple of questions about the emerging technologies that you discussed, specifically regarding hydrogen. Can you tell me more about the planned use of hydrogen, and did stakeholders ask for hydrogen to be modeled, or was that something that came from SPS?
So that last question is a combination of the two. SPS initially proposed a hydrogen case. We also had a stakeholder request where we would do an aggressive hydrogen assumption, which I'm going to talk about in the second presentation, where we would increase that 30% hydrogen by volume to actually 50% hydrogen by volume. So it's a bit of both.
Okay, and did you analyze, or will you analyze the sourcing of the hydrogen? Has SPS considered where the hydrogen will come from?
Yeah, so at the moment, we've assumed essentially there will be a hydrogen market. So you're going to be able to essentially purchase hydrogen. For our cost assumptions, we assumed $1 a kilogram, which equates to around about $7.40 at MMBTU for hydrogen. In addition to the cost, which we're considering kind of up the burner tip, if we want to call it that, we also include pipeline infrastructure. And the way we did that, we assumed $250 million of pipeline costs for every 2 combustion turbines that would be converted to hydrogen.
Okay, and then will SPS inquire any further how the hydrogen within the market was produced?
No, we assumed there would be, like I said, like a market. Now, when we come to actually make these decisions, to be clear, we're obviously going to have to issue an RFP and have these assumptions firmed up.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Kara. I think we want to make sure we try and get through some number of these questions. Again, keep in mind, people, we're going to allow for submitting questions by Friday and further follow-up sessions here. So thanks for that. Athena, you got a question, I think a quick question on the long duration storage.
Yes, how is it defined in your study?
So long duration in this particular study. Sorry,
Say it
Athena,
again. Sorry. Say it again, please.
No, I was going to say long duration storage in this particular analysis is 100-hour storage, so multi-day storage.
Okay, so it is not considered to be dual mid-range and long range then?
Maybe, Athena, do you mind just like kind of defining what you're thinking of when you say mid-range?
So not NREL, DOE has recently defined long duration storage and has broken out some of it from 100-hour down to 8-hour and even 6-hour, and I'll send you a chart. How's that?
Okay, perfect. And just to kind of maybe circle back, the options that we have are 4, 6, and 8, and they're included under both the existing technologies and the long duration. And then in the long duration scenario, we also have the 100-hour on top of those 4, 6, and 8.
Okay. Okay.
Thanks. I think we're going to try and jump to a couple of questions, and Ben, I think we want to make sure we give enough time for the next presentations as well. So I think we'll make sure we track these in the chat. There was one topic Jeffrey Pollock asked about some of the other reliability metrics. I think that'd be good to get some clarification on.
Yeah, Ben, so looking at the scenarios that you modeled in slides 6 and 7, can you say that the reliability metrics like reserve margin, expected unused energy under all those scenarios are generally the same or similar? I mean, are there differences? I mean, are we comparing apples and apples, I guess, is the real question in terms of reliability.
So in terms of the reserve margin that we're planning to, they're the same. But in terms of the reserve margin that's actually constructed, you end up with very, very different reserve margins. So when you start looking at, and Linda, do you mind just going back a couple of slides to where we've got some tables? It might help this explanation. Maybe, there we go, perfect. Go down just one more to the 2040. There we go, perfect. So Jeff, as we start looking at these scenarios where we kind of have, like, let's look at the multi-jurisdictional baseline, where you can build firm peaking generation. A model's typically going to solve more towards your plan and reserve margin. So if your PRM's 15%, you're going to see an actual reserve margin closer to 15%. When you start limiting those technologies to just batteries, wind and solar, for example, under the existing technologies, what you're really doing is you're really planning more for energy adequacy than you are reserve margin adequacy. So you start seeing actual reserve margins that could be 80%, 90%, because really you're planning for energy. Now, in theory, that gives you the same reliability for a system, even though you've got different reserve margins. But it's certainly true, the less dispatchable and the less long duration storage you have on the system, the more you're at risk of adverse weather. So if you're all wind, solar and 4-hour batteries, even though we're meeting our energy requirements and our resource adequacy requirements, if you have a day of, say, low wind production, that's not included in the model. So extreme case, then you're probably not going to have the same reliability as you would if you had that same generation as long duration storage.
When you said 80% reserve margin, I assume you were talking about based on nameplate capacity.
No, based on accredited capacity.
Oh, okay. 80% based on accredited.
Yeah, because essentially what you're doing there, Jeff, is when you look at that existing technologies case, for example, right, is you're building enough wind and enough batteries to serve energy in all hours of the day. So you need enough batteries in order to dispatch that wind across more than, say, 4 hours. So you're planning for energy, which is what you typically do anyway, but you're planning for energy. And to be honest, you're not really thinking anymore about, hey, I just need to meet this 15% reserve margin. If you don't have just dispatchable resources, then that becomes less of a consideration.
Got it.
Okay, I think we're going to try and catch a couple. I think these are just clarifying questions. And then, I guess, Ben, how much time, your next presentation, how much time we want to make sure we provide for you to present? And then again, need more time for questions.
So probably about the same amount of time as this presentation, but I'll be honest, Jay, they are stakeholder scenarios, so I expect some stakeholders are going to have more questions.
Yeah, understood. So I think a couple of these we can catch. Athena asked a question on hydrogen. I think this is just clarification whether this is in the, I believe if you show your slide, it is in the emerging technologies area. Just
it is, yeah.
Yeah. James Hall asked about on the slide, SPS has 7,500 megawatts installed capacity. Is this just New Mexico or total service territory?
Total service territory, Texas and New Mexico.
Okay, that's what I thought. And then let's see. I think, sorry, guys, we're going to take a couple out of order and then we're going to move on. Again, we're keeping track here, and we'll make sure we get through all the questions over time. Margie'd asked a question. I think we can leave it right here on the slide. Margie, do you want to go into it? So I think a few people had this observation is on the change in the rank order of the costs under these different technology scenarios.
Yeah, Ben, this question is to help our stakeholders really interpret and understand these data for the PVRR, the revenue requirements. If you look at the planning forecast, 15% PRM, looks like in the 2030 timeframe, the long duration storage delta is actually greater than the hydrogen, but then in the out years that reverses, and
Yep.
hydrogen becomes more expensive than long duration storage. Am I reading this correctly?
You are. So what I suspect is happening here, Margie, with 5 seconds to look at this, is in those initial years, as you look from 24 to say 2030, you're building combustion turbine generators without hydrogen blending. So essentially, it's lower cost in those initial years. Then as you start looking further out ahead, those combustion turbines that you built in the early years through 2030 have to blend increasingly expensive hydrogen. So the long duration, essentially, you're paying for that capital investment up front, but you then have continued lower costs and you don't have to worry about that increased hydrogen blending.
Okay, that's super helpful. And then also, so people understand, if you look at the 2030 net present value numbers, so does that PVRR delta, are they cumulative, right? Is the existing technologies plus long duration storage, it's got its own PVRR delta of 320 million, right? It's not existing technology, not the 381 plus 320, but these are individual numbers. Is that for that particular portfolio of the existing technology plus long duration storage or plus hydrogen?
No. So if you go into that one case, we're essentially saying existing technology is $381 million more expensive than the multi-jurisdictional baseline. The long duration is 320 million more expensive than the multi-jurisdictional baseline. So they're individuals, you don't add them together, you don't do anything like that.
Thank you, Ben, super helpful.
Okay, I know we have more questions piling up here, and we do want to provide enough time for Ben's second presentation on the stakeholder requested scenarios. So I think we're gonna shift over to that. Again, as I said, we're tracking the questions. We're going to make sure we provide additional sessions to get through all this material. So with that, Ben, you want to carry forward? And then again, please post your questions in the chat when we get through the end of this. I think probably we'll reserve some time for the stakeholder that requested each of these scenarios first, and then have some further group discussion. So thanks. So let's carry on.
Yep. Okay, so let's just start first of all with the SPS modeling sensitivities. So we can go over these pretty quickly. Essentially, as we discussed in prior meetings, we're going to model, we modeled a transmission network upgrade cost sensitivity, where we increased the transmission network upgrade cost from $400 to $600 a kW. And then also we've done both low and high natural gas market energy price forecasts. So I think what this highlights is when you do these sort of sensitivity analyses, is it does change both the cost of the portfolio and then also the resources that are selectable or selected within each portfolio. However, when we look at our resource range from our base cases, remember it was anywhere between 5 and 10,000 megawatts depending on load forecast. What that's really telling me is the load forecast is the defining sensitivity in this IRP. And while these other sensitivities do change things and they do make a difference, fundamentally all of the resource portfolios still remain within that range. So just based on the sensitivity analysis, we wouldn't necessarily be recommending a change in our statement of need. But let's just quickly look at them and we can get through these in just a few moments. Go to the next slide, please, Linda. So first of all, again, if you just increase one variable within a model, all you do is increase the cost of something. There's no way the cost of this portfolio is going to be less. The only way the portfolio can do is go up in cost. So unsurprisingly, when we look at the cost of under high transmission network upgrade cost, every single portfolio was more expensive. The cost increase is anywhere between $600 million to $1.3 billion on a PBR basis. And then the overall selected resources are pretty similar to the $400 a kW case. So the portfolios really didn't change that much. In terms of like the summary, and we'll look at these numbers in a moment, we saw slightly fewer solar resources in the long duration storage case through 2030 under high transmission network upgrade cost. We saw fewer wind generating resources in all cases in the second part of the decade, or the second decade, I should say, and then a minor increase in new battery storage in each of the portfolios. Now, keep in mind, as I've previously discussed, we did not model any transmission network upgrade costs for batteries. We assumed they would all be co-located with either wind, solar, or other sites of retiring thermal plants. So we go to the next slide, please. What we're seeing here is it's arranged slightly different because I want to try and highlight the difference between the base cases and the sensitivity cases. So the yellow section at the top is the data that you've just seen. So this is total resource additions, total costs for each of the scenarios, just under the plan and forecast. And then in the second section at the bottom, now we're looking at the differences if we were to increase the transmission network upgrade costs. So if we were to just pick on one, let's pick on the long duration storage one, just because it's got numbers that's changing. Under the 15% PRM, what we're actually seeing is the long duration storage case would go up $1.2 billion on a PBR basis if you increase the cost of transmission network upgrades. And then you could see incrementally, we would add about 90 megawatts of storage, so a very small amount of storage there. And there's the reduction in solar generation that I was talking about to the right. You would see 810 megawatt, reduction in solar. So in terms of order of magnitude, yes, these resource portfolios are moving. The cost is certainly going up. That's obviously, not questionable. But in terms of the actual resource mix, yes, there's some slight changes. Maybe that's solar's material for the long duration, but for the most part, they stay pretty similar. And then if we go to the next slide, we now see the same thing, but through 2040, the cost remain the same. We're already showing the cost for the full planning period. We see some additional batteries being added because they're exempt from the transmission network upgrade costs. We see fewer wind resources marginally, and then a little less solar on the system. But fundamentally, the resource portfolios remain within that same band, that same range. So impactful from a cost perspective, not so much so on a resource selection perspective. And then if we go to the next slide, we also did a high natural gas market energy price forecast. Again, if all you're going to do is really increase the cost of one variable, you're expecting costs across the board are probably going to go up. And that's what we saw in all cases through 2040. Now, what was really interesting is in the very tail of the analysis, so 2041 through 2043, the actual existing technologies case where you had lots of wind, solar, and batteries actually becomes slightly less expensive. Haven't dug into huge amounts of detail why that's happening. I think it's pretty obvious at the moment we increased natural gas prices and market energy prices. So now you're increasing your revenue from selling that energy into the SPP market. So that was kind of maybe an unexpected outcome there. But if you look at the cost impacts, you're really looking anywhere from $29 million to $306 million increase. Now, historically, when we've done high and low natural gas prices, they were more impactful than they maybe appear now. And that's mainly because as you start transitioning away from a kind of a co-gas portfolio to a more renewable heavy storage and even gas peaking portfolio, you tend to not see such a big impact from natural gas prices as you maybe did 5 to 10 years ago. And then again, just kind of the summary from here, you actually see less wind resources and less batteries under a high natural gas price. Now, while that may seem a little bit counterintuitive, what you actually see is you just see a lot more solar generation. So under a high high natural gas case, what we're actually seeing is the time in the production profiles for those resources matter more. If we go to the next slide, here we see the impact again, less storage, more solar. And then if we go to the next slide, we'll see less wind in the out years. So you went just one slide too more. Can you just go back to perfect? So now we see again, less storage, less wind, more solar, and then the increase in cost between those portfolios. On a normal resource planning analysis, I would usually say $170, $280 million is material. When you start looking at the margin of error for long duration storage in hydrogen, I'm not saying $280 million is not material. I'm just saying that that's probably in the realms of the margin of error of that particular scenario. And then what you see there is the reduction in costs under a wind, solar, and battery case, just as we start selling some more energy into the market and earning higher market energy revenues. And if we go to the next case, we also have the low natural gas price scenario. And again, I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. But if again, all you do is decrease the price of one variable, you can expect the cost of all the scenarios to decrease. And that's what we saw. Similar sort of range, cost decreases anywhere between 30 million and 378 million on a PVR basis. And then when we look at the scenario, we're looking at less batteries, fewer wind resources. And then again, the long duration case is selecting fewer solar resources. So if we go to the next slide, again, here we just kind of see in those graph format, and I'm going through this very quickly. I'm hoping people can look at this in their own time, but more storage, slight change in solar, particularly on long duration cases, and then a reduction in all of the scenarios across the board. And again, usually $30 million to $335 million would be material, but just keep in mind the margin of accuracy over 20 years for some emerging technologies. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, please, Linda. And we can skip over this one. This is just the resources through 2040. So I went through that very quickly because really what the summary is here is there's not a huge impact to the range of resources we recommend seeking in a future RFP. It stays pretty consistent. So now let's look at some of the stakeholder requests. And one of the requests that we got was to evaluate accelerated compliance with the Energy Transition Act, which would include 80% carbon-free resources by 2030, 95% by 2035, and then on the pathway to a 2040 zero carbon target. We were requested to do this under the long duration storage case, assuming the planning load. And then when we look at the results here of just our actual base analysis under that assumption, so without further constraining the model, we actually met those two requirements. We actually got to 80% renewable resources by 2030, 96%, so a percent higher than the request, by 2035, and then increasing to 97% by 2040 and 99.6% by 2042. In order to get that incremental 100 by 40, we actually have some existing gas units, existing gas CTs that would either have to be retired early or converted to hydrogen or to carbon capture on those units to get that remaining kind of 0.4%. And then just also, there are some challenges when you're part of an integrated market in how you capture the market purchases and market sales, the carbon attributes connected to those two kind of components. So Jay, I don't know if you want me to pause at the end of each stakeholder request and ask for questions from the people requesting these individual ones, or if you want me to go through them all and get questions.
Just to get a range, so I think we're trying to take a break around in another 20 something minutes. How much more material do you have here?
I probably could go through the 20 minutes and get through this entire presentation, and then we can use this afternoon's time for questions.
Yeah, let's proceed with that. Let's keep your momentum.
Okay. So if we go to the next scenario, in this case, we were asked to evaluate a virtual power plant. And when we talk about virtual power plants, we have to put this into a modeling input. So we have to kind of quantify this. And the way we modeled the VPP was essentially, and this was based on discussions with the stakeholder, we looked at about 5% of SPS's New Mexico residential and small C&I sales. We looked at that as a megawatt hour value across the course of a year. And then we calculated how much distributed solar and distributed battery energy storage would we need in order to supply that level of load. And when we worked that out, that came to 113.3 megawatts of distributed solar. And then all we did is we sized the batteries about 50% of that request. Obviously, those numbers would be subject to confirmation under a real program. We modeled this scenario against the existing technologies under the electrification emerging technologies load assumption as requested. And then kind of just an initial comment is we used the NREL data to cost the distributed solar and the distributed batteries. The model did not pick those resources the first go around on an economic basis. So what we did is we forced those resources into the model, basically said, hey, Encompass, you will select these resources, then we re-optimized. And what we actually saw when we added these resources in was it avoided building 30 megawatts of supply side utility scale battery energy storage and also 50 megawatts of utility scale solar generation resources. And it increased the cost of the portfolio by $82 million on a PBR basis. Now, I've got some comments in for each of these scenarios because we can only kind of model these as indications of the impact these programs would have. In order to really model the impact such a program would have, we would have to have very program-specific technical characteristics and costs. So that's really just what that comment's saying is we would need some further detail. So we're not by any stretch of imagination ruling this out and saying the number's $82 million. We're just saying under the inputs and assumptions that we evaluated, there was an increase in cost of $82 million. And if we go to the next slide. This was an interesting one. So in this case, we were asked to essentially model time of use rates. Now, in the last meeting, we were asked, were we going to model this gross load or net load? We modeled this net load, which is actually quite an aggressive assumption. I think that might be hard to introduce an actual tariff that had variable time shifting. But either way, we modeled it kind of on an aggressive assumption. And again, we assumed 5% of SPS's New Mexico residential and small C&I load could be shifted from a net on-peak hour to a net off-peak hour. In this case, we kind of did that same calculation and came up with a 120 megawatt time of use program that could be called upon once a day, 365 days a year for a duration of no more than 4 hours. So in other words, every day Encompass could look at our load profile, take the 4 hours that have the net highest peak and simply shift them to a different time. In addition to the 120 megawatts of size of the program, we also grossed that up by 15%. So our thought process here was if you avoided that peak load, you wouldn't have to carry planning reserves on that number. So if you gross up 120 megawatts, you end up with 137 megawatts. Critically, we did not assign a cost to this program. So this program was zero cost. And then we evaluate it under the existing technology case, under the electrification emerging technologies load assumption. So now when you start looking at what this program avoided, it avoided 30 megawatts of load, 10 megawatts of solar, and avoided 250 megawatts of battery. So in short, if you think a battery is going to get, when you get high penetrations of batteries, maybe 60 to 70% of accreditation at that stage, you're really just kind of offsetting that with this time of use dynamic load shifting program. Since we evaluated it at zero cost, of course it's going to show customer savings. There's no way it can. If you can just literally just pick up peak hours and put them in non-peak hours, it's going to save you money. So the PBR savings was $294 million over the 20-year planning period. And kind of the next step here would be to evaluate those potential savings against the potential impact of implementing such a program. And then if we go to the next slide. We also did a demand response program. So in this case, we evaluated a scenario in which we included just an additional 200 megawatts of DR on top of our existing DR programs. So again, program a size of 200 megawatts, could be called upon once a day, 365 days a year, again, for a duration no more than 4 hours. Once again, we evaluate this program at zero cost, so it's going to show savings, there's no way it can. And we did this under the long duration storage case, under the planning load assumptions. In this case, we avoided 400 megawatts of storage, 170 megawatts of wind, and we added 120 megawatts of solar. So total system costs were reduced by $439 million on a PBR basis. Again, no surprise it showed cost savings. We modeled it at zero cost. And you're going to have to compare those cost savings against the cost of implementing the program. Now, furthermore, we assumed that this program could be called upon once a day. Now, if it's a zero cost program, the model is going to select it once a day. So you need to find customers who are willing to be interrupted every single day. Now, if we were to do an analysis where we said, hey, you could be called upon 20 times a year or 50 times a year, you're more likely to be able to get customers to sign up for that program. But of course, you're going to see decreased benefits in costs. If we go to the next slide, I'll go through these real quickly just because I know we're going to get a lot of time for questions. This was the case I discussed earlier. So this was requested under our base case assumption. So SPS's hydrogen conversions, we essentially conformed with EPA 111D. So we assumed 30% hydrogen blending by volume by 2032 and 96% hydrogen blending by volume by 2038. We had a stakeholder request that we do kind of like an accelerated or more aggressive hydrogen blending scenario. And in this case, what we did, we just increased that first step to 50% hydrogen volume by 2032, and then continued 96% hydrogen by 2028. So again, we compared this against the hydrogen conversion base case, of course, under the electrification and emerging technologies load assumption. Under this scenario, essentially, it was exactly the same resource portfolio. We saw an extra 10 megawatts of battery energy storage, which is kind of noise when we look at our resource need. And the portfolio cost increased by $16 million on a PVRR basis. That's a relatively small number from kind of maybe what our expectations were. I think part of this is down to the fact that we only adjusted, obviously, the price of hydrogen, the volume of hydrogen. So we still assume the same availability and the same cost of infrastructure, i.e. the same pipeline cost, the same pipeline to CCs ratio. So these numbers would obviously have to be firmed up with a future RFP. And then if we go down to the next slide. Coming down to the last couple of slides, another request that we got was to model reciprocating engines without a sub-hourly credit. So we evaluated, or we added reciprocating engines to our list of resources available for selection. And we received this cost and technical characteristic data from Wärtsilä, who manufacture reciprocating engines. And in this case, we compared the hydrogen conversion case under the planning load assumptions. So again, we made those same assumptions for hydrogen conversions for the reciprocating engines as we did for the large frame combustion turbine generators. We limited the amount of reciprocating engines that could be added per year to 2 resources, but each of those resources consisted of 3 units each. So they were around about 18 megawatts a unit, There was 3 of them, so each resource was 54 megawatts-ish, 57 megawatts per resource. And what we actually saw when we did this modeling without the sub-hourly credit was a very large build out of reciprocating engines. So essentially it replaced a lot of the battery energy storage, maybe half of the battery energy storage, and reduced a lot of the wind generation and maxed out the maximum number of reciprocating engines it could build. In total, this decreased the system cost by $519 million on a PBR basis. However, I do want to make one very critical observation here when we talk about this scenario, is we did not include any incremental hydrogen delivery costs, i.e. the pipeline, the infrastructure cost for the additional RICE units. So we assumed that that hydrogen infrastructure would be in place with the combustion turbines that were built in this scenario, and these RICEs would essentially benefit from free infrastructure. So if you had to go and build new pipeline to service the reciprocating engines, these cost savings that you see, this $519 million, will fundamentally change, and likely the resource acquisitions will change. I think if we go to the last scenario, we now did the reciprocating engines with a sub-hourly credit, and this was requested by a stakeholder. And in this case, what we were trying to capture, and I don't want to speak for them, so maybe if I get this wrong, they can come up, when we start asking questions. But our modeling is based on hour intervals, right? We model on an 8,760 hour view of a year. There's an argument the stakeholder put forward that if you were to model on a more granular level, let's say on a 5-minute increment level, you would see additional benefits for generation that can start, sync to grid, ramp up, ramp down quickly. They did their own analysis and essentially calculated a negative fixed cost for batteries, reciprocating engines, and gas combustion turbine generators to try and reflect the benefit of sub-hourly dispatch and sync to grid. So after reading their documentation, we kind of modeled it. I'm not saying we necessarily agree. That's not for discussion today, but we modeled as requested. Batteries received the highest sub-hourly credit. So batteries essentially instantaneous. You can go from 0 to 100 in 0.0 seconds. RICE units, and our stakeholders can speak up if I get this wrong, I think can go from 0 to full load in 5 minutes. So between 10 of that unit to start, 5 minutes later, that unit can be up to full load. So that kind of received the second highest sub-hourly credit. And then CTs, which are considered fast start CTs, usually you start them, it's 5 minutes until you get to grid sync, and then you can start ramping up after 5 minutes, and you're pretty much at full load in 10 to 12 minutes. So they got the lowest of the 3 sub-hourly credits. What was really interesting when we did this analysis is then the Encompass really went back to selecting battery energy storage instead of CTs and reciprocating engines. In other words, if you gave the battery energy storage this very large sub-hourly credit, then those batteries essentially become almost free according to the data that we used. There was no benefit for doing CTs or reciprocating engines. The one thing I would say is if we were to incorporate the sub-hourly credit approach, is I don't think you should keep a fixed sub-hourly credit static over the 20-year planning horizon as additional sub-hourly capable units come online. But now I'm very much in the weeds. So I'll move on and just say, we were not able to really compare the cost of this scenario against other baselines because you would have to essentially respin every single analysis to incorporate these sub-hourly credits. You couldn't just do it with just the change case. So next slide, please. I think hopefully, Jay, I got through that in 20 minutes and I'm on time.
Yeah, no, I did want to check. Wasn't there was a requested scenario by the Sierra Club? Has that been still in the works or addressed offline?
Yeah, so we had one request which was to essentially incorporate it proposed environmental legislation, specifically 111D. And we, rather than do that as a stakeholder request, Jay, we incorporated that into our base case modeling assumptions. So all of our hydrogen assumptions earlier that we presented incorporate that 30% hydrogen blending by 33, 96% by 2038.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. All right, again, I asked everyone to be flexible here. So I know we'd scheduled a break at 10:30. I think we'd still like to stick to that. And so given the limited time, I think we want to first, this remaining period here, we want to provide those that have requested these scenarios to ask any clarifying questions or comments on those. And of course, we don't have everyone in the room here, but I think we have a few of the folks that requested these. When we reconvene, it will go through a discussion with the whole group, but just want to start there. And let's see, I think a couple of the demand related requests, I do not believe either stakeholder is here that requested those. Is that correct? I think that was Jim Desjardins and Mike Kenny from Sweet.
That's correct. Those were the two stakeholders.
Okay, well, I think there'll be more to discuss, and when we come back after the break, I think we can focus on those. James Hall, I think the hydrogen scenario was your request.
Yeah, I don't really have any. I don't have any questions on. Hey Ben and everybody. I don't have any questions on the scenario. It's pretty straightforward. I'm sort of cheated because I have a request on a different scenario, and that's I keep hearing these 80% renewable met in an expedited time frame by 2030, or a slightly longer time frame in the base case. Again, is that SPS territory? The average 80% across the whole deal, or is that New Mexico specific, and some sort of accounting allows you to put the 80% on the New Mexico side?
No, so right now, James, everything we've looked at is system wide. So there is no, in any of the modeling we've looked at, there's nothing to do with Texas or New Mexico. Every number we look at is complete SPS system.
Okay, yeah, no, that's really helpful. No, I don't have any questions on the hydrogen. If I do, I'll think about it and follow up, Jay, via your process.
Okay, thanks. David Millar, I think this last scenarios on the reciprocating engines were your requests. Do you have other clarifying questions?
No, it's it all makes sense to me. And definitely pleased with the results as I've seen them, and just very interesting. Thank you.
David, I have one request to you, and you don't need to respond now. Can you just send me an email, please, and let me know if your sub-hourly credits are considered confidential or not?
I will send you an email, sure.
Thank you.
And in short, they're not, but that's fine. I'll send you a note.
Well, let's see. I think Margie, I think we're a little ahead of schedule, but
so Jay, I think the scenario on the accelerated carbon free, I think we have Athena on the line, and there may be others that help define that scenario.
maybe it was a group. I thought it came from Michael as well.
Oh, did it? Athena, were you part of that scenario request? And if so, do you have any comments?
I am sorry. I'm getting confused between PNM and SPS, so I could have been, very well could have been, but I might not have been.
That request came from CCAE members, mostly via NRDC.
Oh, great.
Do you have clarifying questions on what Ben presented?
I mean, we have questions about some of the assumptions, like the use of hydrogen. I've asked some of those questions. I'm assuming hydrogen was included in the modeling used for the accelerated decarbonization.
No, I believe, just real quickly, if we can go to the accelerated slide, please, Linda. I believe the scenario from memory was the long duration storage case. Yes. So in this scenario that we were asked to evaluate under these sensitivities, there is no new gas or hydrogen build out at all. Everything is storage, wind and solar.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. And then when you get to demand response, I do have some questions. Michael couldn't join us because he's on vacation right now for the week.
Sorry, sorry, I didn't see who you represent. You have clarifying questions on that topic?
Yes, I was looking at the comments as the program was evaluated at zero cost. It's not surprising the program shows cost savings. Did SPS provide these comments, and should the request have included more specification?
Ben, you can, let me give us a first attempt at that. I think the SPS modeled as the scenario as requested, and the idea of using no cost is to identify the potential program benefits. And so when the results here show total system cost reduced by 439 million, that's showing you the potential benefit of a resource like this, and then in the future you would evaluate against the cost of implementing a program. But this is to give you a range of the benefits, and as I understood that was it was requested that way to try and give that sort of boundary analysis.
Is there does SPS have an estimation for the cost of implementing such a program? I think, we're interested in what would the cost to SPS be if it were to implement a DR type program.
So, Ben, let me just be clear, but this was the parameter of the request by the party. I know, and the SPS does have.
I get that. I just I'm responding to the comment. So our concern is, well, what is the cost to the company for implementing a zero cost program?
I'm gonna look to Ben for a second.
Yeah, I don't have that information offhand. I think, we've got a follow-up meeting next week or whenever it may be, Margie. We can perhaps look to present some information then. I think one thing I just want to make very clear, though, on this first sentence, and we can certainly follow up with your request, but this isn't in any way, shape, or form meant to be kind of like a derogatory comment where we're saying, well, of course it's going to show cost savings. This was just purely to just make the statement that, hey, if we're going to model something at zero cost, then of course it's going to have to show cost savings. So I don't want anyone to interpret this like this is some way derogatory or we're belittling this idea. I think what we can do is we can aim to give some more information at the next stakeholder meeting. And then, Cara, the other thing I would like to just mention again, these savings are based on us being able to get enough subscription to a program that would be callable 365 days a year. So that's kind of the other dynamic at play here. We would need to obviously, one, see how many customers were willing to sign up for that program, and then if we had to offer different levels or different number of call outs per year would impact those PRR savings.
Thanks, Ben. And sorry if my tone comes across as potentially confrontational. It's not meant that way at all. I really am just curious about those potential costs. And I didn't think SPS interpreted our request and with derogation at all.
Okay, perfect. And like I said, I didn't, but just to be honest, it was more as I was reading that sentence the second time, I was like, does that come across like a little bit like, you know, belittling the idea? So I just want to make sure you're on the same page.
So let me jump in and add, thanks for that. The idea is if these results from any of these runs encourage people to think about action plan items, that's why we're doing this. We're not at the point where the stakeholders have the ability to send the utility off to design a new program in this IRP process. Right. So again, think about if these results motivate a suggestion on an action plan item. That's the purpose of having these results shared at this point.
Sorry, Sydney, I see your hand up. Did you have a clarifying question on these results? And
would Ben please display the hydrogen modeling assumptions slide again?
Yeah, Linda, if you can just go down maybe 2 or 3 slides, I think you should hopefully hit that up. Oh, sorry, there we go. Perfect.
Okay, no, I have no clarifying questions at this time, but could you please keep that up so I could look at it a little bit more closely? I assume this is on the GridWorks webpage.
no, look, to be clear, the second presentation, Ben's team was working on it right until we started here. So that we did not have a chance to get it ahead of time. So we're pretty much all seeing it for the first time.
Okay, thank you. But it will be posted, right?
Correct. Yes.
Yes, correct.
And not just that, I think as we've alluded to a few times, we're going to schedule another follow-up session, partly because of the volume of material here and new material next week. So this is not our last chance to work through things. And with that, Margie, I think we're going to take the scheduled break, give Ben a break. Hopefully he can go make himself some tea. I'm going to go reload on coffee and want to thank everyone. When we start up, we will go, into more discussion, particularly on the second presentation. I think a comment for the group along the lines of what Margie was just saying. We're going to go into the latter part of the discussion today, talking about the feedback for the action plan. And I would encourage you to channel your energy and thoughts on, your suggestions to SPS in, how they come up with action plan items, based on these modeling results. And, look at that's the next step of the work here. So again, please focus your constructive thinking in helping them prepare that plan for the PRC. That's it for me.
So
Margie.
it's 2:34 Mountain Time. We'll resume at 2:45. That will be 11 minutes from now.
We have Ben back online.
Yep, I am back.
Okay. Okay, Margie, what's our next block of time here? I think it was approximately an hour.
Yeah, we've got 65 minutes to really talk about the recommended portfolio in terms of what Ben and team have thought about in terms of going forward recommended portfolio and questions for that. So now until about 65 minutes, an hour and 5 minutes from now, and we'll take a short break after that.
Okay, I just want to click, Ben, I believe that was all the material you have to present, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I was going to just kind of talk about recommended portfolios based on the first presentation.
Okay. Maybe what I would suggest though, Margie, I think if I think we want to do any follow-up to the last, our last section on the sensitivities and the stakeholder requested runs. If the group has other questions, try and tackle that first. If there are no further questions, then I think we can go back to the recommended portfolios, but I just want to give others opportunity if there are other further follow-up on some of the last material we just saw before the break. I actually had a couple. Josh Smith, you have your hand up first.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks, Jay. Thanks, Ben, for going over all of this. And I may have missed this, and if so, I apologize. But could you provide a little bit more detail about how hydrogen was factored into the base modeling that you did? And in particular, are you assuming that power plants that are added in the modeling are modeled under sort of a base load type category under 111B, or I guess just a little bit more detail on what you're assuming there, given the options, the regulatory options for new gas generators under the proposal?
Yep. So Josh, what we did for the hydrogen assumptions was, first of all, we incorporated 111D into the hydrogen ratios. So we looked at 30% by volume by 2033, and then 96% by volume by 2038. And in terms of how we provided that hydrogen to those units, we assumed there would be a hydrogen market in place, so you'd be able to purchase hydrogen. And for each 2 CTs, we included $250 million of capital costs for a new pipeline. So the first 2 CTs incurred $250 million, the second 2 CTs incurred $250 million. Then on a cost basis, we assumed $1 a kilogram for the cost of that hydrogen at the burner tip. So that works out $7.40, I think $7.50 an MMBTU for the cost of the hydrogen. So just to maybe recap, Josh, assuming there's a market, including the cost of the pipeline and the hydrogen at the burner tip, and then incorporating 111D for those ratios. Now, we didn't assume there was any generation that fell below, I think it's 20%, you know this better than I do, but I think you kind of have the 20% capacity factor and then the 50% threshold. We factor.
Okay, thanks, Ben. That's helpful. I'll think that through a little bit more. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Josh.
So do we have other questions from the group on our scenarios?
Jay, it looks like Cynthia, you had wanted to go back and relook quickly at the dynamic load shifting and demand response cases. Is that true, Cynthia? If so, what would you like to come off mute and
Thank you.
guide that?
I don't remember what is the scenario those cases are run against or run on.
Okay, yeah. Linda, if you're still on the second presentation, do you mind just going up to the dynamic load shifting scenario? Perfect. So the case here, Cynthia, is the existing technology case, so just wind, solar, 4-hour, 6-hour, and 8-hour batteries. And then it's under the highest load forecast, the electrification and emerging technologies load forecast.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Same question for the demand response?
Yes, and I got my answer.
If you can,
Perfect.
well, I think the demand response was slightly different to the demand response, because I think the demand response we were asked to do, under the long duration storage case, under the plan and load assumption. So this one included the 100-hour storage devices, and it was the intermediate of the load forecast and the middle load forecast.
Okay, thank you.
Ben, I actually had a clarifying question on this slide. If I read this right, this is a 200 megawatt demand response resource, and you're saying you avoided 400 megawatts of storage.
Yes.
you had a chance to look
So-
into that. I mean, that's a extremely good leverage ratio.
Yeah, so let me talk about kind of that. Now, keep in mind, we also do add some solar. So the accredited capacity, you have to take into account the impact of the less storage, the less wind, and the more solar. But your point's well taken, Jay. And the reason that is because when we start looking at storage, 4, 6, 9 hour storage, we're using the effective load carrying capability to assign the accredited capacity. So as you add more storage, to the SPP system, not the SPS system, the SPP system, the accredited capacity of that storage decreases. So considering we gave the 200 megawatt demand response the entire accreditation, essentially you're offsetting more storage than 200 megawatts because that storage gets less than its nameplate accreditation.
Okay, that's very helpful. Yeah, so I follow you now, but with the additions plus the way the demand response treated relative to storage.
Yeah, now that brings me, and I really don't want to go down this rabbit hole,
Yeah,
but I will just make one other caveat just as we're looking at this. Right now, this assumes existing SPP methodology for demand response. So in other words, the way you count demand response right now is a load reduction. You put a 200 megawatt program in, it reduces load by 200 megawatts. There has been some discussion within the SPP is why does demand response get preferential treatment to, say, battery energy storage? In other words, they're both doing the same thing. One can dispatch and one can reduce load for 4 hours. So there has been some talk of demand response using the ELCC methodology. If that was the case, you would see a similar impact to as you increase DR, you would see a reduction in storage on a 1-to-1 basis, as opposed to this 2-to-1 basis you currently see.
Okay, I followed. Margie, did you have a question? You came off mute.
Yeah, one more question from a stakeholder who's not here but was active in defining the virtual power plant behind the meter solar scenario. If you could go to that slide, please, Linda. Ben, can you please elaborate on the results of this in terms of the overall cost? It increased the overall cost of the portfolio, even though it avoided some battery energy storage and solar resource investment. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so let's just take the solar because that's kind of the easier to look at. When we look at utility scale solar, we're looking at dual tracking solar facilities that get around about a 32% capacity factor. When you start looking at distributed energy solar, you're typically talking fixed, so it's not tracking the sun, fixed rooftop solar, which according to NREL data we use, I believe has a 17% or 17% capacity factor. So in order to get the same megawatt hours out of rooftop solar as you do utility scale solar, you need to add more solar to the system. Then when you take into account economies of scale savings, the cost of rooftop solar on a megawatt hour basis is going to be higher, or excuse me, on a megawatt basis, is going to be higher than utility scale solar just because of those economies of scale savings. So those are the things that are driving the cost of that scenario up. Lower energy because the capacity factor is lower, and then higher cost on a megawatt basis.
Right, thanks, Ben. And that assumes that the utility pays for those behind the meter systems as opposed to the customer investing in those.
That's exactly right. So everything else in that scenario is all else equal. Ownership, capital expenditure, stuff like that. So everything else is equal.
Great. Thank you, Ben.
We have any other questions on these scenario results? Okay, not seeing any others. Ben, if you want to transition back to, I think, the topic here was on some of your end slides in the first presentation.
Yes, if we can go back, sorry, Linda, to jump around on you, but if you don't mind going back to these slides, perfect. If we can go down to the conclusion. to the very last slide. Perfect. Okay, so when we talk about recommended portfolios, this is where I have a little bit of heartburn or a little bit of struggle trying to come up with a single recommended portfolio. Right now, we have 3 load forecasts that we're using, one being obviously significantly higher than maybe the other 2. And then also with us planning for the Energy Transition Act, as I've mentioned earlier, we're very much reliant upon technologies that maybe are not commercially available today, or they have a high level of uncertainty where we really need to see what the cost of those technologies is from an RFP. So when I look at our statement of need inputs, and I can throw this over to Zoe and Brooke and others in a moment, but really the way we're approaching this is kind of a range. And we're breaking these resources down into 2 distinct buckets. So we're looking at kind of those variable energy resources, being renewables, wind and solar, and then also those dispatchable resources. Now, those dispatchable resources, considering the need to be carbon free, at least by the end of 2044, they're more uncertain. So, oh, we just lost the presentation. Give Linda just a couple of seconds. Okay, I can do it from here, Linda. I know it's not quite zoomed in, but I only need a few more moments.
Apologies.
So as we look at the range of resources, we have in our analyses, based on our generic cost assumptions, somewhere between 4,300 megawatts and 6,600 megawatts of renewable generation, and anywhere between 1,000 and 4,300 megawatts of dispatchable generation. Total resource need is somewhere in the 5,000 to 10,000 megawatt range, very much dependent upon load growth and what we start seeing, especially with that electrification forecast. So my recommendation right now, subject to a kind of, having this discussion, would be issuing a request for proposal next year with these ranges underscoring the RFP. And then see what we get come back from the RFP in terms of availability of resources and cost of resources, and then reevaluating the scenarios that we looked at when we have firm pricing and hopefully a little bit more clarity on some of the outstanding load forecast uncertainty. So I'll maybe just pause there, Jake, before we kind of throw it over to you. I'll maybe just throw that over to Brooke and Zoe and maybe Matt, and see if those guys have any comments on that.
Brooke, Zoe, Matt, any other further comments you want to add to what Ben said?
Nothing that I would add, Ben.
Yeah, I don't have anything, Ben. Thank you.
Likewise.
Nailed it.
All right, I'm taking that.
I think we want to open this up for a discussion with the group. Feedback for the SPS team on what they're showing here and kind of how that translates into the different action plan items.
And Jay, maybe I'll just add one clarifying point before you get any questions. I just want to make it clear, these ranges are guides. So I don't want to come out here and say, we will build no more than 4,200 megawatts of battery energy storage. If we see results that have more than that, dispatchable batteries, for example, we absolutely would pursue that if it was in the best interest of our customers. This would really just be a range and not an upper and lower bound.
So maybe for context for the group, can we talk through how that would work, right? So you're ready. This information be used to help scope a broad-based solicitation that'll go out next year. We've seen some questions like this. If certain technologies look more favorable, less favorable, or you could also see if you have less bids than what you have scoped here. So I guess maybe let's talk about the first one. I think there was a question of if solar looks potentially more favorable relative to what you've assumed here. How would you evaluate and kind of make adjustments for that?
Yeah, so what we would do, and let's just go back, Linda, sorry if you don't mind, maybe 4 slides to the first table that shows our resource need through 2030. Okay, and if we can just maybe zoom in, Linda, sorry, on the plan and forecast in the center if you can. Okay, perfect. All right, so in this, let's use this like a real world example here. If we look at the existing technologies case, we have 3,500 megawatts of wind modeled, and then 1,020 megawatts of solar generation modeled. Let's say we issue an RFP next year, and let's say our total, just for ease of this example, our total renewables is in the ballpark. We end up with 4,500 megawatts of renewables. But when we actually look at the real world pricing, we see a much more balanced approach between solar and wind. What we would do, Jay, is we would incorporate each of the shortlisted proposals, whether it's wind or solar, into our Encompass model. And we would then re-optimize Encompass based on real world RFP bids. And Encompass would say, actually, based on real market data, I'm going to build 2,000 megawatts of wind and 2,500 megawatts of solar. That would be the most economical and reliable solution to our customers. That's how we feed it into the model. We would take all of the bids. We would probably have to shortlist them, create a cut list, just because I expect we're going to get many. And then we would incorporate those shortlisted projects into our Encompass analysis to pick the lowest cost portfolio.
Okay. I have a couple other follow-up questions, but David Millar, Bob, Brooke just raised her hand. I don't know if there's anything she wants to add or clarify.
Hey, Jay, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to touch on another component in addition to what Ben said. You know, we'll also have a reliability assessment that accompanies the formation of that recommended portfolio. So I know we've talked about it being a reliable and economical portfolio, but we will pull in, you know, one of the biggest movements from a generics to actually evaluating real bids that come in the RFP solicitation is pricing, of course, but also things like location. You know, and so in your solar example, there will be considerations for concentration of solar in physical locations on SPS's system, you know, as an example. So those kinds of details can greatly influence, those and a host of others can greatly influence the reliability aspects of a recommended portfolio or different portfolios that make it to advanced stages of the bid evaluation. So just a quick example that came to mind to that was the solar concentration, but in your example where different portfolios are being developed based on actual bids, you know, we start to drill in even further than that with some reliability parameters.
And I think that starts to get to answer Athena's question, but Athena, David had his hand up first, so I think we'll let him go, and then we'll get to. Thanks for people starting to put their questions in the chat. We'll start working through those after David's question.
Thanks. For Ben, are you guys able to or going to show not just the PVRR, but also average rate impacts and average impact on customer bills?
But for this analysis or for the RFP?
For the IRP. This analysis.
Yeah, I maybe throw that one over to Brooke or maybe the regulatory team. At the moment, kind of our analysis was concentrated on PVRR as opposed to rate impact. Brooke, Zoe, any thoughts there?
I agree, Ben. You know, this is generic modeling. It's producing a range of resources in categorical groups, dispatchable variable energy resources. I think it's more informative for customer rate impacts, more detailed customer rate impacts on a recommended portfolio, in particular, actual projects that SPS would be bringing forward from a awarded bids perspective and ultimate regulatory approval standpoint.
Just like just so the group can understand, like of your range of total costs, what proportion is covered by the analysis here? I know in our case, fuel purchase power covers roughly 2/3 of total bills in Hawaii. So, this kind of analysis would cover that range. Do you have that? Can you give people some understanding of at least basically what's excluded here and some bound on the number?
So I don't have that information offhand, Jay. I deal solely with generation costs. I really couldn't tell you what our other costs are right now. Is that something, and again, maybe looking Brooke to you or Zoe, is that something we can give an order of magnitude estimate of the next stakeholder meeting?
Yeah, and Jay, make sure I just understand your question. When you say modeled here, are you talking about this table? Or are you talking about, because I think one of the tables was production costs. So that was an all-in, system perspective across the planning horizons that are shown. So that would include, incremental new resources as well as existing
Sorry, I think you're
resources
right.
on the system.
Well, this table shows the delta, right? And then it's a subsequent slide that shows.
Oh, I see.
Right. I mean, the NPV is your total system cost, running the system in the model over the time horizon. But
right.
It's not every single I mean, I think what David's saying, it's not all inclusive, every cost as utility.
Yeah, well, that's true. This is the cost to serve load. I don't think but it does include some incremental transmission, I believe. Right.
I'm just trying to help, if you guys can give the group some rough order of magnitude, for your total revenue requirement, what's the difference between that and what's modeled here?
Yeah, we can prepare some of that information for the next meeting, Jay. We don't have that at this time, just given the proximity, closeness we are to the modeling results we're showing here today.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of making the numbers meaningful for people in their everyday experience, I mean, what I've done is you take the total number there and you basically divide it by the sales, right? The retail sales, and you get an average rate. And you can see how those change over time to numbers that are more relatable. So that would be my pitch to try to incorporate that.
Thanks.
No, we can.
Oh, go ahead, Ben.
No, to say, yeah, we could talk about it, David, and see if there's anything we can do for the next meeting.
Okay. Our other question up here in the chat, and it's from Athena. I'll let you go. I mean, it's focused on the criteria of the RFP. I think Ben and Brooke had given some insight into some of the other factors, but I'll let you pose the question the way you want, and the team can fill in, the SPS team.
This is difficult because I'm not sure how best to present this. I think when you were mentioning the statement of need and you were talking about the different scenarios, I think it seemed to center mostly on cost, and that is just cost to the company, and which would be passed on to the ratepayers. But is anything being taken into consideration for if decisions are made that on down the road result in a worst situation, like, if more gas is brought on rather than retiring the gas faster, we have an acceleration of climate change and problems. I guess I bring it up because I was just in northern New Mexico seeing all the burn sites. And I think we really need our electric generation companies to step up and do their best to help with that. I don't know how else to put it. It's just a bit. It's not going to be one single bottom line of dollars. That's all.
Yeah. So I think, Athena, maybe how I would describe our RFP analysis would both be quantitative and qualitative. So we would pick, the Encompass model itself is going to pick the lowest cost. That's what it's kind of designed to do. But the way we typically evaluate qualitative benefits is kind of like with a scoring metric outside of the model, and then as confirmation analyses. And I get to my point now. So we're going to consider system reliability. We're going to consider our ability to meet the Energy Transition Act. We're going to consider no regrets risk, I think is kind of what you were describing there. We're going to do, we're going to consider the locational value of generation on the SPS system, the impact of the expected unserved energy and reliability of the system. So there's probably 5 to 10 qualitative criteria that would be in addition to just simply the lowest cost.
And is that notated somewhere?
Not in these slides. No, we haven't got into that level of detail yet.
So I'll just jump in here. Athena, according to the IRP rules, ahead of the IRP, the utility is required to submit all the documents and contracts required to facilitate the RFP itself. And then there's a chance for stakeholders and staff to submit comments on it. I think that might be where that might be the process in which you're asking about, is when do you get to see those RFP documents? And that's contained in the rule that happens just ahead of the RFP being issued. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
I mean, it is, except it doesn't really give people, in my opinion, a time. And I think this statement of need should probably include it. Rather than waiting on the back end.
Yeah, I'm looking at Cynthia's comment. Yeah, I think maybe Athena, a couple things to offer, or maybe the group here can offer on other parts of the process here, where I think your feedback will be valuable to SPS and also in the PRC's decision making. So coming up this afternoon, we're going to talk about the action plan process and provide a means for stakeholders here to give feedback to SPS on elements of the action plan. So I think some of the topics you're talking about seem very ripe for providing that feedback. The IRP document itself will be submitted to the PRC later after this process, and opportunities for your feedback there. And then I think as Brooke and Ben, or as Zoe and Ben said, as subsequent RFP documents are developed, there's opportunity for feedback. And generally, in my experience, you have to have an explicit section on evaluation criteria for the bids, just so everyone knows what the process is. So sorry, I don't want to, Brooke has her hand up. So anything I misstated, but I think trying to give a sense of the broader opportunities in these different processes to provide that feedback.
EJ, thanks. Yeah, it's Brooke. No misstatements. I was just going to add a little bit more process. So Athena, you mentioned, timing and when that occurs. There's another part of this process where the commission engages an independent monitor or independent evaluator that oversees the RFP process, as well as SPS's bid evaluation, as bids that are received in that RFP are considered for the recommended portfolio. And so it's important to work through that bid evaluation criteria that Jay was describing with the IM, also the independent monitor. And that's really teeing up the process that Zoe was describing that will occur in 2024, again, before the RFP is issued, for one, the commission to engage the independent monitor, and two, the bid evaluation criteria to be evaluated by the IM, and then three, SPS or the utility to provide those RFP documents in this IRP case, in this docket, publicly make them available, and then subsequent comment rounds on those documents, again, before the RFP is issued. So that's another reason why that happens a little closer to the issuance of the RFP.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Let's see, going through our chat. Cynthia, your question's up next. says 2028 is the first year of new resource need. Do you want to,
Yeah, I'm
anything you wanna
here.
add?
So Ben, 2028 is the first year of new resource need, is that correct?
Yes and no, Cynthia. I'm sorry to give you one of these answers. the way we've done the modeling is we've assumed all new resources can come online in 2028. That's the earliest.
Okay.
But when we come to issue the RFP next year, that will not be a restriction. We will not say you cannot be in service before 2028. If there are
Okay.
resources out there that can come in service or come online, and I'm thinking repowers of existing PPAs maybe, if they can come online in 26 or 27, and that's more economical, then that's absolutely something we would pursue, assuming we can obviously get through the regulatory process, construction phases and stuff, you know.
Right. No, that's great. And then I just wondered about whether you issue an RFI first and then an RFP. And, you know, as I understand, an RFI is sort of a looser, faster process. And then you could do a quicker turnaround with an RFP based on the RFI, or you've probably already thought through all that.
Yeah, we haven't internally agreed what our structure is going to be. What I will say is we need to issue an RFP certainly for kind of that 28 to 29 timeframe. I don't see the need to issue an RFI. We need to have firm proposals in hand where we can make decisions. When we start getting later out, though, Cynthia, I think to your point is a valid point. When we start looking 2030, 2031, and we're a little bit more reliant upon these emerging technologies, there could be an avenue where maybe we do an RFP with an RFI component, but we haven't spoke about that internally and really quantified the value just yet.
Okay. Well, and I think a RFI, rolling RFI over time in the future is going to really serve you well. And then you can cull format RFP and such. But I was glad to hear that you're thinking about those expiring PPAs on wind, solar that may repurpose to include storage.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia. Chad Crowley, your questions up here in the chat next.
Thank you. Appreciate you guys for having this call. Ben, you mentioned earlier in the presentation that that 1,021 megawatts of solar that's visible on this slide as well is assumed to have no network upgrade costs associated with it, because it's essentially, I'm putting words in your mouth, but I read that as saying it's a fuel switch, right? With you taking old fossil units and switching them to gas, or sorry, to solar. Could you talk a little bit more about the assumptions there? I mean, are you looking at specific plants that are expected to transition their interconnection rights to solar? I guess that's the first part. And the second part is sort of, how are you approaching, like, looking at fuel switches more broadly in terms of evaluating what resources could be considered eligible for a fuel switch, or how they're viewed or accredited or valued in that context?
Sure. Yeah, I can answer that. So specifically with the 1,021 megawatts first. So you're calling it a fuel switch, and yes, it is in principle, but what we're actually doing is we're looking at generator replacement. So a generator retires, and then through SDP rules, we can then put new generation on its place and reuse those existing interconnection rights. So the way we calculated that 1,021 megawatts was we looked at our existing gas steam units that are scheduled to retire within that kind of 2030 timeframe. And we just said, hey, we've got these 4 or 5 units retiring. They're 1,000 megawatts or 1,021 megawatts. For the purposes of modeling, we will assume we can put solar generation at those facilities without incurring any new transmission network upgrade costs. In other words, they would reuse those interconnection rights.
And is that a one-to-one? Are you assuming like a capacity accreditation requires an overbuild, or how are you viewing that from that perspective? So
yeah, so at the moment, we've assumed a 1 1-to-1 ratio on a nameplate basis. So you retire 100 megawatts of gas steam, you put in 100 megawatts nameplate of solar, and you get something less on the accreditation perspective. However, in addition to that, if you recall earlier, I mentioned we do not assume any incremental costs to transmission network upgrades for batteries. So if you were to put in, say, a 1-to-1 nameplate of solar at that facility, you're also not incurring any transmission costs to potentially put a battery at that case to get you a 1-to-1 accredited capacity out of that site. So, Dad, first of all, did I answer that part of the question? I've got a couple more responses for you.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thanks.
Okay. So just to kind of continue on your initial line of questioning, first of all, why solar? Why not another technology? Well, again, just keep in mind, this is for generic modeling. We'll see actual projects and RFPs. But typically when we look at our gas steam units, we're looking between 50 and 200 megawatts. So there's absolutely nothing preventing you, for example, putting wind at those sites. But typically when we see economies of scale, wind is usually going to be 200 megawatts up. So when we're replacing 100 megawatt gas steam, we just feel like solar is probably more likely, although that would be confirmed in an RFP. And then finally, when we start talking about larger units, so we start talking about a retiring coal plant, for example, with 1,000 megawatts nameplate capacity, we expect the resource mix of those sites to be more different technology. So we talk about like a trifecta. With a trifecta, you do solar, wind, and say batteries, or 4 resources where you do solar, wind, batteries, and maybe a reciprocating engine just to keep David happy. So I think it depends somewhat on the size of the resource and then when those units are retiring.
Understood. That's really helpful. And sort of, I know this is probably something that ties into the previous comments, but when you're, would that be something as part of an RFP for a complying bid that you would say, hey, these types of resources would or wouldn't be eligible for, these particular applications? Or how is it that you would evaluate, like, like if a developer wanted to say you're taking these gas units off and you're retiring them and we want to use your interconnection rights, like, what does that process look like from you guys?
Yeah, so I think our best example here is our RFP from November of 2022. We gave bidders, potential bidders into the RFP, different options for how they could structure their proposal. One of those options was just essentially you can be anywhere on the SPS system, you can just bid in a new project, that's fine. But then we had more nuanced scenarios where we said, hey, we're going to be retiring Plant X1 and Plant X2 at the end of 2023. You could bid in to do generator replacement of this specific generator. And we did that in our last RFP. So I would imagine we would do something very similar in our next RFP without making any promises until we've kind of discussed the format.
No, and that's really helpful. And so I guess as it stands now, you guys are thinking, maybe this is a question you can't answer, and this is my last question because I don't want to take up too much time. Do you have a sense for how you view generator replacements? Like, is it you're looking for the 1-to-1 replacement? Is it you have an ELEC value? And that's a question I asked earlier that, I think you guys will answer later. But when you're thinking of like a future ELEC that you don't know, or this, that, and the other, when it comes online, what the net load looks like. I mean, are you guys looking at more of a capacity perspective, or are you looking at it more of a nameplate perspective, or too early to tell? Or
I think it's a little too early to tell. What we're really looking at is, one, the lowest cost solution, and then you've got to factor in all those qualitative benefits I was talking about earlier to Athena. So it's going to be lowest cost with a big asterisk that says, and also provides reliable, the most reliable system, the best locations. There's going to be all those qualitative benefits we need to consider.
Thanks, Ben. It's really helpful. I appreciate your time and help.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Chad. Margie, you have a question here.
Yeah, thanks. My question, Ben, is to help people understand the upper end of the resource needs range. And can you comment on your team's confidence level about the 18% PRM and the electrification forecast demand, since those are two things that drive the upper bounds of the resource needs? Can you just comment on your confidence level of those two key variables?
Yeah, so in terms of the 18%, if you ask me, am I confident 18 is the exact number, then no. But if you ask me, am I confident that within the next decade, the SPP is going to increase the planning reserve margin, based on many, many discussions, I think that's a high probability. So I don't know 18% is the number. Maybe it's 17%, maybe it's 19%, but I think it would be reasonable, dare I say prudent, that we at least start looking the likelihood that that PRM is going to increase. Now, keep in mind, when they increased the PRM from 12 to 15% this last summer, there really wasn't any notice period given. They didn't give us 5 years notice in order to get new generation online. So I think we should go into our planning decisions with a little bit of headroom in case the SPP do increase the PRM, where we're not scrambling for uneconomical resources because that's all what's available. Now, in terms of the electrification load, how confident are we? Well, we do think that's an upper end of the boundary there. When we spoke in the last meeting, essentially we said we're going to include all of the electrification megawatts that was in the S&P Global study. So really, we're assuming none of those large C&I customers are going to serve that load with behind-the-meter generation. So there's one argument that yes, that bound is probably on the higher side, assuming there's some behind-the-meter generation installed. But what it doesn't cover is the potential for new resources or new technologies, coming online. So we see a lot of requests coming in from data centers, from emerging technologies for clean fuels, hydrogen production, clean aviation production, which if this oil and gas load was partly served by behind the meter generation, these additional customers may step in and fill that void. So I think, Margie, to answer your question, is I'm really trying to kick this can a little bit down the road. I think we should issue the RFP with these upper bounds in mind. Then let's see the availability and those costs of those resources that come in. We're going to be 6 to 12 months further ahead. We're going to be 6 to 12 months further down the line, and we can reevaluate the portfolio in the likelihood of those higher boundaries actually coming into place.
Thank you.
Thanks, Margie. I don't see any other questions in the chat at this time. I just had one, Ben, and this is kind of a follow-up from earlier presentations, and it's on that last point. If you look at the size of the resources here, right, I mean, we're talking about nameplate capacity close to the current, at least accredited capacity that SPS has today. That, I mean, right, this is putting, you're solving for a big need here. I guess to put that in context, what's the largest solicitation SPS has done prior to this?
So our largest kind of CCN was 1,230 megawatts of wind generation in 2017.
Okay, and I guess what sort of considerations is the team looking at the various different risks here? Either can think of this level of resource doesn't show up, or just also the flip side of that, if it does, and just managing that level of work in this time frame.
Yeah, so great questions. I think, as we look at the risk, one is we need these resources to turn up. We need to see this many megawatts in the queue, and it needs to be relatively economic projects. We don't want to see wind projects turning up that's $500 a megawatt hour. I mean, we need to see enough resources and at low enough cost to make this happen. Now, in terms of an internal resource, even though SPS has not done a procurement of this size before, this is more common in our other jurisdictions. maybe I'm not saying necessarily this exact size, but a very large RFP like this. So we can certainly lean upon our other teammates certainly in Colorado and in Minnesota, and they have done these sort of large scale acquisitions before. It's a lot of work, I'm not going to deny that, but I think we've got the experience in order to actually get through this RFP.
Okay, no, that's helpful. And then just the project risk of, right, it's one thing to have a bid and approve it, but to get through to execution and online in the time frame, you know, if things slow down or projects drop out, what sort of mitigation steps do you have you're thinking about?
Yeah, so really we kind of, I've maybe put this into two separate buckets, Jay. The first thing is when we do that qualitative review of each project, each proposal that comes into an RFP, the in-service date is one of those critical variables that we look at. And we say, hey, is this realistic? Do we have a customer who's coming in and they're saying they're going to be in service in 2025, but they haven't even entered the SPP interconnection queue, or they don't even have land rights? So we do look at that, and we score projects based on their availability or their potential of meeting the in-service date that they propose. So that's kind of the first step. Now, the second step is to then kind of, I don't like to call them backup proposals, but to have alternative proposals that we can call upon in case some of these projects fail, whether that's through the negotiation phase, whether that's through them not being able to secure financing, whatever that issue is. We want to have a healthy portfolio of projects we can then call upon. So if we lose a 200 megawatt solar project, hopefully there's going to be at least another 200 megawatt solar project in the wings ready to step in.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Chad just brought to, sorry, Chad, I missed your earlier question. Please go ahead. We do have time, as well as if other stakeholders have further follow-up questions. So please go ahead, Chad.
Oh yeah, Jay, no worries. You got a lot going on. Yeah, Ben, I guess the question I had was, when you guys are looking at load patterns over this forecast period, you know, you mentioned earlier with some of the things that you were looking at net load. How can you talk a little bit more about how the net load shape sort of changes on the system through the forecast period? And the reason I'm asking this is focused, you know, as SPP is working on coming up with an ELEC methodology, but I was curious, like, do you guys see the technology, you know, technology specific ELECs changing over time as your load patterns change, or, you know, how kind of, and how rapidly those changes happen in your model, that kind of stuff? Or are you considering those things right now? I'm thinking particularly solar, you know, which, as you've seen in like ERCOT or whatever, the, you know, the marginal capacity accreditation of the next unit drops off a cliff pretty quickly with deployment. So just kind of curious how you guys are thinking about, you know, net load and how the resources that you're looking at contribute to that, you know, meeting that net load.
Yeah, no, great question. So when we look at the modeling that we've done today, and then the modeling that we would do for the RFP, we are incorporating the effective load carrying capability accreditation for wind, solar, and battery energy storage. Now, I know obviously FERC reversed their approval in March for SPP's ELCC methodology, but it's our expectation that SPP are going to propose new ELCC language towards the end of this year. So we expect the ELCC will be in effect by the time we procure these resources. And then to your point, what we see is essentially diminishing capacity returns year on year. So if you pick a solar resource now, for example, until recently, we were the only people who had solar on the SPP system. So we had all 192 megawatts of solar on the SPP footprint. As that penetration increases, your accredited value of solar is going to decrease. So right now you may get something extremely high. You may get 80, 85% accreditation. But as you start seeing more solar across the entire SPP footprint, we have a declining curve. And I think it gets down to maybe around about 50% accreditation, maybe a little bit lower, down to 40% when you get about 20,000 megawatts of solar on the SPP footprint. So we do that same methodology for wind. We do that same methodology for limited duration resources, 4 hour, 6 hour, and 8 hour lithium ion batteries. And then when we do our modeling, we're essentially seeing that accredited capacity. So let's take solar, for example. We're going to see as you add more solar, the value of capacity declines. And then also you have no value for solar in the winter months, or very, very little value. So what the model is then forced to do is it's forced to pick other resources to fulfill that capacity need in the winter months. So that's why you see that huge build out of battery energy storage in order to meet our resource adequacy requirements in the non-solar peak months. Likewise, all else being equal, you're going to have to add either additional solar or more batteries in the summer months to maintain that accreditation as it falls for solar resources. And that's why I was saying to Jeff Pollock earlier, when we were talking about reserve margins, when you start having these renewable resources, limited duration resources, you really can't plan a system and maintain a 15% PRM. Because if you're adding solar resources to the system, you're getting accredited capacity for those resources in the summer, but you're getting zero accreditation for them in the winter. So you're still going to be building CTs or CCs or batteries, whatever it may be in the winter. And what you see is your summer accredited capacity far, far exceeds 15% PRM. So I'm sorry, I rambled a lot there, but I really liked the question. I felt like I needed to give a long explanation of that one.
Well, I think, as somebody who could talk about it all day himself, I understand and appreciate it. Is there a way for stakeholders, specifically me, to take a look at some of the assumptions that you guys have on the ELCC and the load shape and things like that, so we can provide comments?
So Chad, let me just jump in. Yeah, that information was presented at some previous stakeholder meetings where we're not at a point to go revisit those assumptions in the analysis at this point, but there's a lot of information about how the team used those different parameters. So I'd encourage you to go to the slide decks from the last couple of meetings and you'll find lots of that good information there.
Got it. This is my first one, so thank you for your patience.
We're happy to bring you up to speed and help you move us forward at the same time.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Chad. I think we've kind of exhausted the questions on this topic in the chat. I think I want to give one last opportunity and then we're going to transition. Margie has a transition topic here. Okay, not hearing anything. So Margie, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, Linda, can you move to that last slide, the statement of need input slide that you were just sorry to be showing from Ben's presentation? Thank you, Linda. I just, yeah, the final slide in this deck talks about that statement of need inputs, and I'd like to remind all the stakeholders that there's a companion document that a working group from this set of stakeholders put together on statement of need elements. This is that component of the quantity of resources and type that's needed for that statement of need. And I just want to encourage people, if you have an interest in reading through all the various elements that the working group articulated as being important as this plan goes forward, you can find that document on our website. Deb has posted it under today's meeting materials. It's only 3.5 or so pages long, so I encourage you to look at that as well as this slide from Ben and team as we're thinking about action plans. So I just didn't want people to forget about the great work that was done by the subgroup on this topic. It wasn't exactly these numbers that had to come from the modeling effort, but there was a lot of other good input that people can take a look at. Thanks, Jay.
Thanks for that. And I think we'll well, a couple things. I know we are planning to get together for, I believe, another hour next week to go through some of the more detailed questions. I know Cynthia, you had, posted a number of these in the chat so far. I think we given instruction earlier to send your questions to me by this Friday so we can compile those and put it together for a follow-up session here. So I know we have 10 minutes, but I think we want to keep that time. We still have a lot of other important information to go through in this meeting. So reminder, there's more to come in processing and discussion of these model results. Send your questions to GridWorks to me specifically. We'll get together next week. If you possibly can't be there, we do plan to record that session as a reference for folks. Let's see. Yep, Deborah's got the details in there. And with that, I want to give Ben and the team, a big, what we say here, mahalo, your appreciation for all the work. They were cranking right up until the end here. And a lot has been asked of this team over the past few months. So thanks for your guys' work. I think it's provided great information basis for discussion and for the next steps of the stakeholder group here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Margie.
Yeah,
sorry, Jake, just real quick. Sorry, Jake, just real quick. I appreciate that. I appreciate the feedback. I just want to also publicly acknowledge my team and then the modeling team. To your point, they have worked flat out for the last 2 or 3 months on this. So just big kudos for those guys. They've worked real hard at getting us to where we are today.
So Ben, if you have some names in mind, I would love for you to be able to thank them publicly here in this meeting. If you have a list of them, I would really encourage you to read them out so that we can acknowledge the team as a whole.
Yeah, I will go ahead and do that now. So just want to thank Sonia and Jake on the SPS modeling team, and then also Shireen and Brian, who are my team. And then, although he went and left us, Mr. Chris Whiteside no longer with the company, but he did a lot of work as well. So really appreciate the effort of all those guys.
Great. Thank you, Ben, for acknowledging them. And I know several are on the team. I think I saw Sonia and Shireen and others. So thank you all for the great work. We know this has been a push. We also know that in order to get the urgency of this plan together and filed so that you can begin to invest in those next resources, that we were going to have a really tight schedule. So thank you for being flexible and doing such great work. At this point, I would like to offer another short break for folks, and we will be working with Zoe and team to be sure that the next set of presentations are ready to go. So I show 3:44 Mountain Time. I think that let's give another 15-minute break. So reconvene at 4 o'clock Mountain Time, and our next subject is really going to be, okay, let's shift gears and think about what goes in the action plan, how it gets put together, what the process is for submitting ideas, and we'll go through that after the break at 4 p.m. Great, thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for your continued patience and momentum on this last push for today's meeting, which is really focused on stakeholder input to the action plan. We've got two elements for this last section. We're grateful to have the SPS team, Zoe Lease and Brooke Trammell, give us some context setting about why the action plan, what it's supposed to be, what the integrated resource plan rule says about action plan, and even talk a little bit of update of activities that are underway from the previous action plan that was part of the last IRP. So we'll turn the podium over to Zoe and Brooke, and once they've shared the information that they've got with the group, we will go over a process that we are going to use between now and our next meeting on September the 13th to collect your input and your suggestions on the action plan through a particular process, which we'll go over after we hear the context setting and background from Zoe and Brooke. So over to you, Zoe, and thank you for being here to share the context with the group.
Thanks, Margie. Linda is going to pull up the slides, and while she does that, you gave Ben an opportunity to thank his team. I echo my thanks to everyone on that team, but also just want to express my sincere thanks to Ben as well, who has just been working tirelessly for months on this IRP and on the modeling for it. And as you saw today and heard today, that modeling is now concluding. And so I just, again, want to express my thanks to Ben. And also to say that, you know, we're going to provide an introduction today to the action plan, to what's required of it. And then Brooke Trammell will provide an update on the 2021 action plan, which is ongoing. But everything in these slides today are for exemplary purposes only. So they're examples for you, and there's nothing in here that reflects what we are or are not putting into our IRP action plan. I just want to make that really clear. You might see something or not see something in slides today that you want or don't want in an action plan. And I just want to make sure everyone understands that this is just a level setting opportunity for us, so stakeholders can understand what goes into an action plan and what we're looking for, so that it can better inform the input that you have into the action plan ahead of the September 13th meeting. So we can go to the next slide. Thanks, Linda. So as you heard from Ben, you heard from him on the ranges of megawatt needs that we have for our system. The statement of need is foundational for our action plan, but it is not the action plan. So I wanted to remind everyone today of the rule provision for the statement of need, and that the statement of need is a description and explanation of what our system needs in terms of resources and the technical characteristics of those resources. And you can go on to the next slide. Now, the action plan is what the utility is going to do in the next 3 years to address that need. So what the rule states is that the SPS's action plan will detail specific actions that the utility shall take to implement the IRP, and detail specific actions that the utility shall take to develop a resource solicitation. So, and like you all heard me earlier in today's presentation, the utility is responsible and required to provide RFP documents to the commission ahead of issuing the RFP. So that number 2, detail specific actions the utility shall take to develop the resource solicitations. That really gets to what the utility is going to do to develop the RFP documents that it will ultimately submit ahead of issuing an RFP to the commission. And then 3rd, include a status report of specific actions contained in the previous action plan, which we'll provide to you today as well. So you can go to the next slide. So examples of actions that can be included in the first enumerated requirement, that the utility detail specific actions the utility shall take to implement the IRP. Obviously, issuing an RFP and is going to be on that list. Specific regulatory filings that the utility will need to get resources onto the system by the time they are needed will be in this list. Cynthia, you made a really good point about RFIs for long lead resources in the future. That would be something that would show up on this list as well. In addition to an RFP, if an RFI is needed to get more information about long lead resources to fulfill our need and meet New Mexico ETA requirements, that would be an action that would be included in this list as well. So this, again, these are examples, but this list really does show, what actions the utility needs to take in 3 years to address the statement of need that it will file with the IRP. Let's do the next. And I will also say that the planning horizon in the IRP is 20 years. So while the 3-year action plan will likely be focusing on our most immediate resource needs at the end of the decade, there's actions in here like issuing RFIs for long lead resources that could address also the resource needs we see later on in the planning horizon. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So the second requirement for the utility to detail specific actions the utility shall take to develop a resource solicitation. Examples of what could go into this part of the action plan, developing a model PPA for the RFP, identifying or developing RFP bid evaluation criteria. I think it was Jeff Pollock earlier, or one of our stakeholders asked about reliability. Reliability assessment as part of the bid evaluation criteria could be developed, and that's where it would be housed in the action plan in terms of the RFP documents and what that looks like. So obviously the RFP documents are going to incorporate stakeholder feedback from the IRP process. So the reliability assessment that I just mentioned would be could be incorporated like that, encouraging bidding of emerging technologies, structuring it as an all-source solicitation to obtain bids with technical and geographic diversity. Those would all be identified in this part of the action plan as addressing stakeholder feedback that we've received so far. And then, of course, SPS is going to work with an independent monitor that the commission appoints, and that is also required by the rule. The next slide is our update. So I guess I can pause for a moment if anyone has questions on just that information on what the action plan is and what kind of actions go into it. And Margie, if you would like to provide the information on how input can be provided ahead of September 13th.
Yeah, great. Zoe, can you go back to the first slide of examples, and help everybody understand the acronyms? I'm not sure everybody knows all of those. So if you would translate, that would be very helpful.
Obviously, RFP is request or sorry, request for production is a regulatory, a regulatory acronym, and but oh my God, now that I have request for production in my head, I can't say what the acronym is, but I'll keep going.
Request for
Proposal, thank you. Request for proposal is RFP. I think everyone knows that. PPA is purchase power agreements. DSM, demand side management studies. Time of use is TOU. ICO is interruptible credit options. So just all options for what could go into an action plan. You know, there was a lot of you know, stakeholders wanted us to be modeling and addressing DSM in this IRP. So I put in some examples of things that could go into the action plan that would be responsive to that as well. And sorry for my brain freeze on RFP. That's so silly.
Yeah, questions for Zoe on this before we talk about the process for collecting more input. Although Zoe, I think maybe Brooke, your update on actions that were part of the last plan can also give people more specificity and insight as to what's been, you know, what are typical. So either way, however you guys want to do it, Zoe's okay with me.
And since we're on this slide, I can give some examples of regulatory filings. You know, maybe not everyone has been, I know some people on here have been part of those types of regulatory filings in the past, but you know, for any new resources that come in through the RFP process, SPS will have to ask for a regulatory approval of them. So that could be in a filing asking for regulatory approval of a purchase power agreement. That could be through a filing asking for regulatory approval of new resources, a certificate of need and a certificate of need filing. So those are the types of filings that we see in the future. A big reason why we needed to start the stakeholder process this summer and do the IRP this year, as you all must remember from the first meeting, is because this all takes a lot of time, right? So after we file the IRP this year, we'll be issuing the RFP in the middle of next year. I think the timing is end of June, early July, according to the rules. And then it takes time to get those bids and go through that evaluation process and ultimately come up with a proposed portfolio for the commission to consider. So it does take the full 5 years, starting from this stakeholder engagement to bringing resources onto the system. And a big part of that is after the RFP, we go into the next regulatory step of getting regulatory approvals for the proposed portfolio. So, and Brooke is going to talk a lot about that in giving her update for the 2021 IRP.
Thanks, Zoe. We can be on almost any slide, I think, mostly for discussion here, Margie, and happy to take any questions that anyone might have on the status of these items. But as the example list that we had up on the screen just a minute ago showed, there, examples of action period items include, things that utilities need to do to issue an RFP. And then, as Zoe mentioned, the regulatory filings that oftentimes follow those RFP activities. So following selection of resources, whether that's regulatory filings for commission approval of company-owned resources or PPA pre-approval filings, which in New Mexico is required before a PPA that is executed by a utility can become effective. But it also mentioned unit extensions, so consideration of generation unit extensions and other items. So as this group knows, we did file an update to our 2021 IRP action plan in November of 2022. That update filing identified changes that SPS would need to effectuate from its action plan in the 2021 IRP and the reasons for those changes. But the main result, and we've talked about it throughout the course of this stakeholder process, was the issuance of the November 2022 RFP. So as background, we ultimately were solving for roughly a 600 megawatt need by 2027 in that RFP. In total, in New Mexico, that capacity position is a little bit different, closer to about 527 megawatts. The RFP, as I mentioned, was issued in November of 22, with resource bids due at the end of February of 23, and projects awarded out of that RFP on June 5th of this year. So late July 26th to be specific, SPS filed for an application for CCN approval in New Mexico for the self-build resources that were selected as part of the recommended portfolio, and will also be submitting later this summer a separate application for commission pre-approval of the purchase power agreements associated with that recommended portfolio. So again, to summarize, the portfolio includes 418 megawatts of new solar resources on SPS's system, a 230 megawatt dispatchable gas PPA with a term of 15 years, as well as 84 megawatts of battery storage resources. Along with those additional or extensions of the PPA, additional resources or extensions of the PPA, we also are providing information related to the extension of 2 of our existing generation unit lives, Cunningham 2 and Maddox 2, which will be extended to a 2027 retirement date for Cunningham 2 to match up with one of the new solar facilities that's coming online, as well as a life extension of the Maddox 2 unit at least through 2028. So again, those details and that proposal for regulatory approval of the self-build projects, as well as a forthcoming application for regulatory approval of the PPAs, will be before the New Mexico Commission. The self-build projects are currently docketed in case number 23-00252 UT. And that case is with the hearing examiner. A procedural schedule has been established. The intervention deadline in that case is October 31st, with testimony due December 1st, SPS's rebuttal due December 21st, and a hearing scheduled in February, a Valentine's Day hearing, with the hearing February 12th through the 14th. So pretty key to today's conversation, as well as implications for the SPS's 2023 IRP RFP, is a decision on these resources from both of our regulators. So we also need to get CCN and PPA pre-approval for these projects from our Texas regulator. And we have asked both of our jurisdictions for decisions on this portfolio by June of 2024. So that's very informative, so we can know what projects to include before we issue the RFP in this 2023 IRP process. So even though the projects will not be constructed by then, having regulatory approval both for the self-builds and the PPA projects, we can build those assumptions into our system planning needs for the RFP issuance. So I'll stop there. Margie, I saw a couple questions pop in on the chat. Haven't read them all yet, but we'll take questions on this portfolio and these regulatory filings if folks have them.
Great. Thanks, Zoe. Let's see. Athena, you had a question. How much battery are you talking about? The action plan? I think Zoe said 84 megawatts of battery storage. Is that right?
Yes, we've proposed 84 megawatts. 36 megawatts of that is a company-owned battery at Cunningham 1, and 48 megawatts is a developer battery located in Texas.
Athena, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Great. And Cynthia, you had a question about the resources in, please go ahead and ask your question.
Well, Brooke, I think these resources are included in the scenario analysis, aren't they? Or some of them are?
Some of them are. We also have a rate case pending before both the New Mexico Commission as well as the Texas Commission. A stipulation has been filed in the New Mexico Commission, or in the New Mexico case, as many of you all know. There are some resource extensions included there. For example, Ben mentioned earlier the extension of Nichols Units 1 and 2, as well as assumptions around the retirement of our Tolk generating facility. Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, those are assumed in the modeling that we've presented through this process. What is also included, Cynthia, to your question, is an assumption for resources online by 27. Ben, again, correct me if I'm wrong. So this recommended portfolio from the 22 RFP would be included.
Or is included, The 22 RFP resources are captured in all the scenarios.
Yes.
Okay, that's what I thought I understood. Thank you. And then I asked another question as to whether or not we could get a short write-up on this, but I don't know how much we really need that.
Well, Cynthia, I can jump in here. There's executive summaries that were included with the CCN filings that we have in front of the commission. I'm happy. I think Brooke stated what that docket is. I'm also happy to send those filed documents over.
Well, yeah, no, that's fine. Ed has those, and
okay, great.
Yeah, I can look at those with him if I need to. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Athena, you had one more question about the new gas.
Yes, I think maybe I'm understanding this, whatever that was for the gas, that it was PPAs on existing plants or new plants?
The PPA for the battery is of course new. The PPA for the gas resource is not new.
And a
follow, well, sort of. And a follow on is, are these the same ones that are being considered for hydrogen?
No, I think what we were describing earlier when Ben was discussing the future potential, that would be subject to somebody, developer bidding that. So this 15-year extension, it'll be a new PPA, but I think of it as a bit of an extension because again, it's a resource already on SPS's system under a PPA contract provision today. It was not bid in as a hydrogen conversion in that 15-year period in the RFP.
So then I'm understanding the hydrogen scenarios are new gas plants?
Most likely. I don't think, Ben, again, not to answer for him, but I don't think we've modeled a hydrogen conversion of any existing SPS gas facilities.
And I'm sorry, Brooke, I was on double mute, so I've been answering all these questions and no one's been hearing me. So
sorry, Ben.
I apologize. But no, you're correct. Yeah. So the hydrogen capable DCs that we've seen in the modeling would be new gas that would be converted to hydrogen based on those blend ratios that we discussed.
Athena, did you get your questions answered?
I did. I didn't like the answers, but I did. Thank you very much.
Other questions of Brooke or Zoe on the action plan going forward, or the current one, the one that's been the update that they provided today, which is very helpful. Thank you. Great. Okay, and we will list at that case number in our meeting summary in case anybody wants to also go to those documents. Thanks, Zoe, for pointing out the executive summary. It actually might be helpful for some stakeholders who weren't here to be able to read that update. As so, I'll go pull that down and make sure people can access that. Thank you for that. Great. Anything else from Brooke or Zoe on this topic?
Nothing from me. Thank you, Brooke, and thanks, Margie.
Great. So our plan is to ask for your input on action plan suggestions. Thankfully, Zoe and Brooke have provided not only context, but some specific examples from the past and some ideas looking forward. We'd like to encourage you all to provide that input. This is the last piece of input in the facilitated stakeholder process. And as the teams pointed out, there will be opportunities for public comment, different places along the way in the IRP process after it's filed. But this will be your opportunity to put input into the action plan ideas. So we've created a form, and I will shift my screen to that in a moment here, to capture your suggestions. If you don't have access to Google Docs, you can send an email to info@gridworks.org with your suggestion. And we are requiring your name, your organization, and email, because if there's a question about something, we want to be able to follow up with you. And our plan is to take any responses we receive by noon on September the 12th and use that for the basis of this group's discussion during our meeting on September 13th. And that discussion will be focused on processing those suggestions, giving the utility team opportunities to react to ideas, to offer color, to help us shape those in a way that can be considered, or to decide that that particular item is not appropriate as part of the action plan, but maybe it's dealt with in another part of the IRP, or it's not appropriate. Whatever the resolution of the ideas are, we're going to do that during the meeting on September the 13th. So please provide that input to us. Deborah has put the form, the Google Docs form, into the chat. I'm just going to share my screen quickly so that you can see what it looks like. It's very straightforward. Hopefully you can see. Can you see the form that says SPS IRP Action Plan Input?
Yes.
Great. So we've just reiterated some of the things that Zoe talked about the rule itself and what the action plan should have in it. Zoe already described that. Please note if there are ideas on topics that are beyond the scope of what's listed here, we want to document those and collect those. They may not be within the IRP scope of action plan, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't be documented as part of the process. So please offer your ideas and suggestions and submit as many as you'd like. Please put in one form per suggestion so that we can track them separately. And if anybody does not have access and would like to see the responses that are coming in regularly, just let us know and we can send you an Excel spreadsheet that shows what ideas have been turned in to date in case you need inspiration or have ideas for collaboration with other stakeholders on action plan ideas. So this is the mechanism. It's, like I said, quite simple. It's got a place for your suggestion, a place for your name, your organization, and your email. And then you hit the submit button and you're done. And if you have another idea, it's submit as many ideas as you have, and we will collect those and use them to facilitate our conversation on September 13th. So Deb, if you can go back to the slide deck, I'll stop sharing and offer an opportunity if people have questions about this process. You know, we are pushing the schedule pretty fast and furious to collect this input, and we realize that you all may still be processing the modeling results. I know I sure am. So we want to, again, give you opportunity to digest that material, pose any questions you have about the modeling results by this Friday to Jay, and then also be thinking about action plan items, suggestions that you want to turn into the process. And that will be by September the 12th. If we can get your input by noon on the 12th, we'll use that to form the conversation at our meeting on the 13th, where we will come away from that meeting with a synopsis of those ideas that are of greatest interest to the stakeholders. So before I run through the rest of the schedule, do people have questions about the action plan input process or content? Okay, great. Let me know if you do. So in summary, we've been through a tremendous amount of information today. We realize that there's a lot to process. We realize there's an amazing set of capabilities and insights and perspective from the SPS modeling team that shared not only their own analyses, but the analyses that were requested by stakeholders, which we greatly appreciate. Please turn in your questions to Jay Griffin at gridworks.org by this Friday at 5 p.m. of any unanswered questions. We'll also take all the information from the chat, and we will organize those and facilitate a 1-hour question and answer response session on Wednesday, September the 6th at 3 p.m. We will record this so you can listen to it later if you can't attend. We appreciate the SPS team being willing to have that Q&A session because we realize we've pushed the schedule very tight, and we'll do that on Wednesday of next week. Then there's the September 13th meeting from 1 to 5 p.m. with the input from your suggestions on the action plan will be the basis for our conversation on the action plan. So please put those suggestions in by noon on September the 12th, Mountain Time. The meeting that we had previously scheduled for the 21st of September has been moved till October the 3rd from 1:30 to 3:30. And the focus will be reviewing any content, including the action plan that is at probably getting close, but maybe not exactly signed off, but close to as complete as possible prior to the SPS review and submission process. So we moved that meeting to give the maximum amount of time for that content to be developed and an opportunity to share that with the stakeholders here on October the 3rd. That will be the final meeting before the IRP is filed by SPS on October the 13th. And then we have one final meeting of this group on October the 26th, where we're going to be asking for your feedback on what did you like about this process overall the past 6 months, and what things would you suggest we do differently in the future? And we meaning the collective New Mexico Public Regulation Commission, New Mexico stakeholders, New Mexico utilities, since this is the first time through these new IRP rules, the commission is very interested on what might be done differently in the future to improve this process. So we'll ask for your input when we get together on the 26th, and that will be our final meeting of this process. So before we end, please take a few minutes, if you would, to respond to the meeting survey from today, and Deb will put that link into the chat. It's also shown up on the screen. If you have your phone, you can scan the QR code and answer the 5 or 6 questions about how this meeting worked for you. This is important for us as we process this feedback and try to improve every meeting facilitation in this process. It's also information that will be accumulated and shared with the PRC when we do our final report in January. So as we leave this up, I wanted to thank all of you for your insights, your participation, your great questions, your dialogue amongst each other and with the utility team, and offer this last opportunity for today. If anybody has questions or comments, please come off mute and offer any last thoughts, and we will plan to close our meeting after we've heard from all of you, and then give Brooke and Zoe the last opportunity to give their closing remarks. So questions first. Jay or Deb, did you have anything you wanted to add before I give Zoe and Brooke the closing remark opportunity?
Thanks everyone for your time, participation, and look forward to the next steps.
I will add some of Ben's presentations on the GridWorks website. And we will also have the recording and the chat, and a summary of this meeting will follow probably tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Deborah. Zoe and Brooke, is there anything you would like to add, or Ben or Linda or Shireen, any of the team from SPS? Let me give Zoe and Brooke the first opportunity.
Thanks, Margie. I'll let Zoe close this out. I just want to say thanks to everyone for the continued engagement and participation in these meetings, but also for the great questions. You know, we've covered, as you mentioned, Margie, a lot of content over this summer and through these meetings and through this process, but there's a lot of content here to be had, right? And there's a lot of considerations for SPS's system. And so I just really appreciate the engagement, everyone, to learn about our system and engage, and definitely ditto all of the congratulatory and thankful remarks, grateful remarks for Ben and his team and others in the company. This has been a big lift because it is a big lift and it's a lot of work, and it will continue as we move forward towards the issuance of the RFP next summer and then into the bid evaluation process. So this is a marathon, not a sprint, and I appreciate everyone staying engaged with us. Zoe?
Thanks, Brooke. And I just echo everything Brooke said. We are very appreciative of the engagement of all our stakeholders in this process. And I also just want to say thank you to GridWorks, to Margie, Jay, and Deb for helping facilitate these meetings and helping facilitate getting input to the action plan, our next step, which is important. And we very much appreciate everything you're doing to help the stakeholder engagement process be meaningful for everybody and meaningful for SPS as well. So thank you very much. And really looking forward to seeing everyone's thoughts on the action plan and meeting again next week and on the 13th as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Then we will close the meeting. We'll leave this slide up in case anybody would please take the time to give feedback on this meeting through the QR code or the link. And we will look forward to seeing anybody who can join us next Wednesday for the Q&A if you have questions still about modeling. And then again on the 13th, where we will process action plan suggestion. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.